My name is Councillor Steve Race, and I'll be chairing this evening's meeting. The meeting will be recorded, it's being live streamed on YouTube. Councillors taking part in this evening are present here in the committee room. If any councillors are joining this meeting remotely, they do so as an observer, and they will not be able to participate in the discussion for any planning application on the agenda, although we may take, as this is a pre-app meeting, we may take questions for them in the session.
I believe it's the discretion of the chair.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Fine, thank you. For those participating in the meeting remotely via Google Meet, the virtual meeting technology does have a chat function. However, please only use this to raise IT-related issues. As chair of the subcommittee, I will not be monitoring it. In the event of an internet outage, we will adjourn the meeting and then come back and start again. I'll introduce the members of the planning subcommittee as follows. We have Councillor Sarah Young, we have Councillor Jess Webb, who is our vice chair, we have Councillor Ali Sadek, Councillor Claire Potter, and we also have Councillor Claire Joseph. We have Councillor Michael Desmond, who's running late. I've got apologies from Councillor Lee Scott as well, I think. Next, I'll introduce you to the council officers present in the chamber. To my left, we've got Natalie Broughton, Head of Planning and Building Control. We have Christine Stevenson, Legal Officer, and we've got Gareth Sykes to my right, who is our Governance Officer. Before we continue, I just want to make sure that I briefly outline how this meeting will proceed. The purpose of the pre-app meeting is to make planning subcommittee members aware of planning proposals coming forward. An informal discussion will take place on the application on the agenda. We will first hear the proposed scheme summarised by a planning officer. The applicant or representatives for the applicant will be invited to speak about the scheme, and then members will be free to ask questions of the applicant. Those attending in person or observing this meeting online are reminded that the committee will not be making a decision on the scheme this evening, and I will not be taking any contributions from the floor. This is a meeting in public, not a public meeting. Subcommittee members are not representing either their wards or their political parties at this meeting, and can I emphasise that subcommittee members should not take into account or discuss non-material planning matters, even though it is a pre-app meeting. If a member has any interest related to an application on the meeting agenda, they must consider whether interest ought to be disclosed, and where appropriate, they must withdraw from the meeting while the application is discussed. We will now move to the published meeting agenda, beginning with apologies for absence. And as I say, I think we have Councillor Loader,
Scott, and also Councillor Narcross.
Great, thank you very much. Get my papers in order. Where's the one I need? There we go. Do we need to do the minutes next?
I think it's declarations next.
Declarations, sorry, there we go. Yeah. So declarations of interest from the floor. Councillor Young.
I know we're not representing our wards, but I suppose I should say that I've been quite involved in the process leading up to this pre-application, including I attend all of the Woodbury Down Community Organisation's board meetings. I have taken some legal advice from our legal advisor, and I think our combined view was that it's all right to sit in on this meeting, but I would review myself when it comes to the application itself.
Great, thank you very much. And that's fine by me as well. Anyone else on the committee, anything to declare? No? Thank you very much. And then we have any proposal questions referred to the committee by the council's monitoring officer, nothing that I know of. Thank you, Gareth. And then minutes of the previous meeting. And this is the committee to approve the minutes of the previous pre-app meeting held on the 19th of October 2022. Is everyone okay with those minutes?
I have one amendment, Chair. I was contacted by Councillor Loudett Scott. I forgot to include him that he was present at that meeting, okay. So obviously I'll amend the minutes accordingly.
Okay, but otherwise those are noted. Thank you very much. Great, so we move on to the Woodbury Down Master Plan, and we're being led this evening by Kate.
Good evening, members. Just to quickly say that this is phase 4 of Woodbury Down, not the Woodbury Down Master Plan. Apologies, just so everyone's clear. The pre-application proposals before you tonight relate to phase 4, as I said. I'm not going to be going into them in any great detail because, as we can see, the applicants have quite a substantial team and a detailed presentation. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the presentation pack circulated with the papers originally has now been superseded, and I believe that's been circulated to all of you, and you should have access to a electronic and paper copy. You'll recall that phase 4, together with the phase...
I mean, I've got copies here because I think there's only one minor amendment. There's only one slight minor amendment. So, I mean, I'm sure the applicants will bring it up during their presentation. I mean, I could hand out packs. But, yeah. I mean, I can do it now if you want.
It was circulated online this afternoon, but I think it is a very, from what I understand, it's a very minor amendment to which is quite a large pack. So.
An additional 3 units on a scheme this size, so it's relatively small. I think I'm correct in saying that essentially the main details remain as previously circulated.
Yes, correct. In the revised pack, it's 473 rather than 470 dwellings.
Maybe you could just draw our attention specifically when you get to that bit, to the different part. Thank you.
You'll recall that phase 4, together with phases 5 through to 8, were brought to the pre-app planning subcommittee last October. At that stage, the proposals for phase 4 were fairly high level. They've obviously been, over the last year, been worked up in quite a lot of detail in collaboration between the various parts of the council and the applicant. The scheme has been to 2 DRPs and has obviously been to the previous pre-app planning subcommittee. The applications have been split out now as a result of various logistical requirements. So phase 4 is being submitted as a standalone application for full planning permission, with submission anticipated fairly shortly. And the remaining phases will be submitted as a master plan in due course. This isn't particularly clear, but phase 4 is located in the centre of the master plan area to the southwest of the junction of Seven Sisters Road and Woodbury Grove. It is within the larger site allocation within LP 33. So as a result, its redevelopment for housing is acceptable in principle, subject to a suitably high quality scheme coming forwards that delivers other public benefits. The main proposals are going to be set out by the applicant this evening. They have been evolved in relation to the design from what you've seen previously. They have been subject to a level 1 and level 2 GLA pre-application process and TFL pre-app. And I'll now hand over to Martin, who will talk you through the detailed proposals.
Good evening. Right, I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll start.
Great. Sorry, is that everything okay? Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So sorry, just from my knowledge, we've got quite a few in attendance here. Who is leading from your side?
So my name is Martin Keefer. I'm the architect for the scheme, and I'll be leading the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Off you go.
Right, pleasure to be back here after a year and with some more detail on phase 4, which has evolved, as I hope you'll see, into a very forward-looking and good quality, high quality architectural scheme. I won't talk too much about where it is. I'm hopefully most people in the room are familiar with where phase 4 is on the scheme, but just that it does sit right slap bang in the middle of the evolving estate at Woodbury Down. That's the current site outlined in red on the screen at the moment. So we have Seven Sisters Road to the north, Woodbury Down to the south, and Woodbury Grove to the east, and then St Olave's Church on the west side. Currently 6 existing housing blocks and about 200 dwellings. What we'd like to do tonight is to start off by just talking about some of the themes that have led the evolving design and approach to phase 4. They're summarised there on the screen for you, and I'll go through these in a bit more detail as we go through. But we're going to talk a bit about how, while this is a standalone application, it does take into account the previous and the developing master plan. We're going to talk about public space particularly, and the importance of delivering the neighbourhood square, which sits at the centre of phase 4 and as part of that wider master plan vision. How the scheme delivers affordable housing, how it's been developed specifically to think about and respond to the Woodbury Down identity, particularly looking at more the historic environment at Woodbury Down. and we'll talk about sustainability as well. Just to say that the scheme has evolved in response to a developing planning environment since 2014, when the original master plan was conceived and consented. So there are a number of things that are off on screen. I won't go through these in detail, but these have been embedded within the developed design, from consideration of a greater consideration of trees and how we can retain more trees as a very pertinent local issue on the plot, how the scheme responds to changing policy on things like dual aspects, sunlight, and we'll talk about open space and parking as well as we get in, because those are quite key factors with delivering phase 4. So this is where we are today. Site outlined in red, sitting right in the heart of the Woodbury Down estate. Developed sites from the KSS sites through to phases 1 and 2 on south of the plot, and then phase 3, which is currently under construction. And as we said, we are building in an environment that this is a part of that master plan. I'll talk in a little bit in a minute about how that is achieved. But we're also part of a number of huge achievements that have been made at Woodbury Down and the developing environment down there, particularly around the reservoirs, and that's something that we sought to bring into our proposals. So what's on screen at the moment is part of the master plan work that was being done alongside the development of phase 4. And one of the critical things really for phase 4 is that this is part of a wider network of green spaces that make up the master plan. So the green fingers that were part of the 2014 scheme, partially delivered so far with Spring Park and the area around Woodbury Grove on the south, and then with the forthcoming park in phase 3. As far as phase 4 is concerned, it's really about making sure that those green fingers are pedestrianised routes, that are landscape spaces brought through the scheme, and with consideration of future connection across Seven Sisters Road and into the north of the estate. That really has 2 significant impacts on us about delivery of public space, 2 key public spaces, one of which is the central square, which is going to be the main civic hub for the developing estate, and a more urban central space than they have currently, rather than the parkland that exists around Spring Park. And then there's another muse space that sits between our plot and the St Olave's Church, again, part of that creating north-south connection across Seven Sisters Road. That leads us on to thinking about Central Square itself, which is the kind of public set piece that will be at the centre of the development. We have evolved the scheme since the 2014 proposals to develop it in a way that responds, we think, more to those the directionality and the routes within the scheme. So it previously was an east-west facing square, and now more of a north-south arrangement. That's really, as I say, to connect it into those north-south routes, so it's more one continuous green space as you approach to Seven Sisters Road. That change of orientation has also been achieved through, it's allowed us to retain more trees, and there are a significant number of very high-quality mature trees within that space currently, and we are maintaining all of the A and B category trees. That allows us also to build on their character to create a really vibrant and high quality public space that will be ringed at the ground floor with a combination of commercial and community uses. There is ongoing work at the moment with the council to look at placing a library within that space as one of the main inhabitants. That's something that will likely go on beyond the submission of the application, but is a key part of delivering a civic space in the centre of the scheme. Mark will talk a little bit later about the landscaping here. So we are also creating a significant amount of new housing, which is a combination of social rent, shared ownership, and new market housing. We have some tables later in the document that provide the exact split, but the total is 473 new apartments, just under 50% affordable by habitable room, slightly lower when you look at it by dwelling, 44%. It's been developed with the design that's inherent within the PDA agreement at Woodbury Down, which is a shared equity of view, although we've taken certain decisions on the locations of shared ownership here, which I'll talk about when we get to the plan. And that's been done for some very specific reasons to reduce rental charges. In terms of identity, this is something that we looked at and talked, I think, briefly in the last presentation. We have looked quite carefully at the historic environment around the estate, not just at the new blocks, but also what qualities those existing blocks have, because they are very characterful, particularly the red brick buildings, north and south of Seven Sisters Road. And we've tried to build on that character in the delivery of a scheme which references Woodbury Down, but still looks modern and delivers high quality housing. This is a view looking at the scheme from Woodbury down towards Central Square. You'll see this probably a couple of times in the presentation as we go through. Predominantly brick with white banding and detailing that references back to the estate. We've also looked at and developed with consultants DPQ a cultural strategy for the site, which also takes elements of the local environment, and thinking about things like the signage and how do we build an architecture and a scheme that is specific to Woodbury Down. And then just a quick slide on sustainability. We can build on this later on. The scheme does achieve GLA net zero carbon. It is part of a wider approach to decarbonising the estate, and we can talk about a little bit later about how that's achieved in terms of energy performance. These things sit alongside a general approach to landscape and urban greening, which will create a very green site, both in terms of the public realm and the shared communal gardens in the centre. I don't propose to dwell on this too long, but just these are some slides that look at the issues that we're trying to resolve at Phase 4. So from things like Seven Sisters Road, which we know creates a noisy environment, the existing trees, which we've worked very hard to retain as many as possible, and sunlight and overshadowing from, we've got some adjacent tall buildings. Just to say that these things have been embodied in the design, and when we're looking at them from particularly from a environmental perspective, I hope you'll see that those things have really led how we've approached the massing particularly. These slides just look at the basic configuration of the site, and this is probably clearer in the next couple of slides, but we've looked very carefully at issues like permeability, how you move around the site. That goes back to the principle of the north-south links. We've looked after review with your DRP, particularly about how the character of the buildings changes and responds to different conditions around the site. So from Seven Sisters Road, which is a much broader, larger scale avenue, to Woodbury Down, which is a much narrower environment. And that leads to a certain approach with differences in the building design, which we'll show you in a minute. All of this has been underpinned by an approach to sunlight and daylight, particularly where we're looking very, very hard at how we get daylight and sunlight into the public spaces, into the apartments. And we have some real success stories in there in achieving really good quality and well-lit shared amenity spaces. So this is an aerial view of the scheme looking from Seven Sisters Road. So St Olave's Church is kind of in the bottom of the view, looking back towards Skyline Tower and Residence Tower in the background. As I was saying, there are three building types here. So on Seven Sisters Road, we have taller buildings up to ground plus 10 stories, but with lower sections between. The intent here is to create a repeat building typology that begins to frame that broader road of Seven Sisters Road. Behind that, there are two lower buildings on Woodbury Down. They are ground plus 8 stories, these two with lower shoulder sections. And again, so they're starting to think about that smaller environment along Woodbury Down. And then in the corner, the taller building, which is ground plus 23, sits below the two existing buildings, which are 31 and 27 stories. So almost the little brother of those three. The placement of the tower has been developed in response to both local townscape issues and wind and microclimate views, which we'll evidence shortly. Just another view looking back from, as if you were standing on top of Residence Tower, back towards the plot. And one thing you begin to pick up in this view is, while the buildings on Seven Sisters Road are more continuous, those on the south of the site have significant gaps between them. What you're seeing in the middle there is a podium garden, which is shared by all of the surrounding buildings on phase 4. And those gaps between the buildings go a long way to creating good quality sunlight, both in that public space and, in that communal space and within the apartments that surround it. So this is the site plan. It's a section taken through at first floor level, looking down. So you have the configuration of the buildings on the north and the south, and then you see all of the spaces in between. To be clear on this drawing, the green spaces that you're seeing are at 2 different levels. So the space in between the building is at first floor, and then the surrounding spaces, so between St Olaf's Church, the Mews on the left-hand side, and Central Square on the right-hand side, and the spaces ringing the roads, they're all at ground floor. Mark will talk a bit later on about how this helps us achieve very high urban greening factors, but it is, when you look at it from above, a very green site, and we're creating a lot of space for residents of the site and of the estate to utilise. One thing to note on here is, particularly on Seven Sisters Road, the buildings are set back by approximately 6 metres from pavement edge to the building line. The building line steps a bit, so it's not always the same. But that's done to maintain the trees that form a very characterful part of Seven Sisters Road at the moment. There's significant mature trees. That's also led the way the buildings responded on the left. So this space here, next to St Olaf's Church, is a landscape space that's part of that north-south connection, and again has allowed us to maintain a number of existing trees. The other thing to talk about at this point is about where the various tenures are located. So we have 3 buildings which are market, which are the taller building, building C, the tower, and then buildings A3 and A4. So they form the 3 on the right-hand side. Then there are the ones that are labelled yellow on the plan. They are A1 and A2. They are shared ownership. And B1 and B2, which are the ones on the south side, facing onto Woodbury Down, they are the social rent. We started off with a slightly different arrangement here, where actually there was 1 of each tenure on each side. As part of the work that we've done with the local community through the design group, that has been amended with a particular focus on service charges. So by locating the social rent on Woodbury Down, we can ensure that those buildings are serviced as easily as possible. So they don't have to use the podium that sits between the building, and that means we can keep the service charge for those residents down. I'll talk in a bit about the podium in that. So this is then the ground floor of the building, as you see, stripping away that podium garden. What we have here is a central space which is largely providing parking. Now in this case, 64 parking spaces. This is being driven by part of the estate regeneration approach at Woodbury Down, which protects residents with existing parking spaces. And the work that's been done on the expectation is that the number that will move into here with parking spaces will then be accommodated within that space. It's not all of that. There is some disabled and accessible parking within there that also goes towards achieving other aspects of policy. What the podium does allow us to do is conceal all of that away from street. So the building is actually largely surrounded by active uses, be that housing, or in the case of facing onto Central Square, the shops and retail units. Overall, approximately 75% of the perimeter is active. And that's, as I say, largely achieved by using the podium to conceal the bins, the bikes, and the parking space and the plant spaces in the centre. A couple of slides on the environmental studies, and I'll talk a bit more about the right-hand one, which is wind. But as I say, we have looked very, very carefully at air quality, noise, solar exposure, and wind as a particular local issue. I won't go into these in detail, but the design has been heavily informed by making sure that in terms of sunlight, the central spaces are all well lit, and we achieve, I think, compliance with the BS design criteria on sunlight with about 90%. In terms of noise and acoustics, the building form being more continuous onto Seven Sisters Road actually shields the rest of the development. So noise conditions within the podium garden, and for those people with windows then on the south side, are protected from the noise of Seven Sisters Road. And in terms of wind, so we're aware of the issues that residents have felt around the base of the two existing towers, and have been working with RWDI as a wind consultant throughout the development of the design to make sure that the conditions within the central square are suitable for its proposed use as a civic space, and one that people and residents can enjoy. This is actually the existing conditions on site, and you will notice the green colours are sitting quality, and then it works through the colour range down to the more uncomfortable ones of walking and uncomfortable. And the existing studies do show issues around the base of those, the two towers in particular, but largely in the current condition that what will be the central square is in a yellow condition, which is predominantly for strolling rather than sitting. As I said, this has really informed the way that we have approached our design, and we've worked from the start with the wind consultant to ensure that conditions within that space are positive and suitable for use. That goes back to the developing of the massing, which the way that it raises from St Olaf's Church towards the centre with the predominant wind flow is actually helpful from getting the wind over the site and over that square, to consideration of building form, the canopies, particularly around the base of the building, and the landscape design. And where we are ending up, these couple of slides show the development along the route, but the current anticipation is that wind quality within that space will be predominantly within the sitting category, so suitable entirely for the purpose that we want to use it for. There is some standing that comes about as a result from the two existing towers. So back to that image of a central square and the place that we are looking to create here, framed by the new buildings on the far side, although worth picking up on in this view. So one of the things that we did very early was ensure that there was a gap between the tower and the buildings on the north side. What that does for that space is to make sure that the sunlight, you actually get sunlight in it from various points in the day. So you'll get sunlight within the afternoon for different types of activity and purpose. So this is the dwelling mix where we are at the moment. So the point of change in the document, we did have 470 dwellings. We are now at 473. That breaks down at 264 market, 119 shared ownership, and 90% social rent. And I think we can talk more about this if questioned, but this is aligned with the PDA for the wider master plan development. Worth picking up a couple of things. So social rented units are all Parker Morris plus 10, so that's part of the PDA. They're actually larger than normal. And they are also weighted towards larger family apartments, and there are smaller apartments within the market and shared ownership. I'll try to go through this quickly, but I said at the beginning of the presentation about looking at the character of Woodbury Down, and we have some images up here of the existing buildings, and also some from slightly further afield, looking at the mansion block as a typology and what does that mean for a building in terms of creating a particular type of architecture. Well, it predominantly means brick buildings, often quite simple in terms of their configuration, but they use features like the white banding that's quite characterful at the estate at the moment. and vertical bays within them to create views. And those are all things that we've embedded within the developing design. 3 building typologies, as we explained: Seven Sisters Road, Woodbury Down, and the Tower building. And I'll just quickly show you what that means. So this is one of the buildings that faces onto Woodbury Down. The 2 buildings are principally the same. They vary a little bit for precise configuration. So they have central entrance at ground floor with a covered canopy, and this is where we're looking at some tile details to build on that historic tiled building entrances as part of a characterful part of the streetscape, but a very clear entrance in the middle of the building. 9 stories above that with a combination of red brick and buff brick, using bay windows particularly to build on the design. And if I flip to the plan, so the buildings they use a central stair and lift core, and with clusters of apartments either side. This is done quite carefully to ensure that there are kind of little groupings of entrances into the flats at either end of a short corridor, so not big long corridors, naturally daylit wherever possible, in this case through actually borrowed light through the stair, and then a building form which uses a lot of corners and projections to get dual aspect into all of the apartments. You'll see that theme actually continue in the buildings on Seven Sisters Road. So this is looking at it from the Seven Sisters Road type. These buildings are taller, up to 11 stories. Again, central bay, configured around a central entrance with similar qualities to the one that we were looking at on Woodbury Down. Lower shoulder sections between of ground plus 7, sorry. Now, one thing to pick up on here was whereas the Woodbury Down buildings are entirely symmetrical, in this case you'll see that the building on the front is actually asymmetrical. The balconies are both on the same side. That's been done in response to wind and daylight conditions, so that both of them the balcony gets the benefit of west-facing sunlight in afternoon. Again, similar type of plan. Short corridors with clusters of apartments. In this case, because the buildings terrace along the length, the apartments on the ends are through apartments, so run from Seven Sisters Road through to the south to get dual aspect on those properties. And then lastly, the tower, which sits at the corner of the site, 24 stories tall with quite an expressed ground floor that develops into the commercial and community areas around the square. The building's broken down into several segments, so there's a variation of height in the top, and you'll see how that appears in some of the views. But again, uses the same palette of red and buff brick. I won't go into this too much detail, but the plan's there if there are any questions later on. It follows very much the same principle as the other ones, developing large amounts of dual aspect around the core. And then looking at the kind of combined set of buildings, so this is looking back from Seven Sisters Road with that developing skyline of the buildings along the front, so the variation in height that gives the road a rhythm to it, with the tower peeking up in the background, set behind those mature trees retained on Seven Sisters Road. Looking at the same proposal back from the corner with Woodbury Grove, central square on the left-hand side of the image, and then working back towards Manor House on the right. Looking at the site from Woodbury Down, in this case with those individual buildings with the significant gaps between them. And back to that view, which is looking at the site from Woodbury Down. On the left-hand side is the pedestrian connection that is referred to as the Mews, and that's because it has duplex accommodation at the ground floor. Part of the delivery of some of the family social rent dwellings. They look on to a landscape space that will deliver also play space for use by residents and of the plot and the estate. And then finally, looking north from the junction at the base of Central Square, with the tall building on the left and the Seven Sisters Road buildings at the back there, built around, as I say, the retained trees in the centre. So I'll hand to my colleague Mark, who's going to talk about the landscape design.
Good evening. My name is Mark Bell. I'm from Fabric Landscape Architects. On the first slide, we can see the 4 components that make up the ground floor landscape. Slightly hidden from view is the podium, which is a story up. There's a later slide which discusses that. Effectively, on the right-hand side of this drawing, you have the central square, which is circa 3,700 square meters on the left. The smaller Muse space, which is a north-south space, with St Olaf's Church to the left-hand side, and then to the north, Seven Sisters Road, and to the south we have Woodbury Down. Do you want to go to the next slide? What these slides essentially show is the genesis of this design for the central square, which really is led by the retention of those trees and the protection of those trees and the incorporation of them as centerpieces in the design. From the get-go, we've been working with Woodco and listening to the community as to what makes this area distinctive. There's understandably a great pride in this area. And we all roundly agreed that it's the nature and the context that makes this distinctive. And although Central Square and this site is somewhat disconnected from those obvious signs of that nature, that being the reservoirs and the New River, effectively what we tried to do here is hold up a mirror to that context and bring as much of that in as we can. So on the left-hand side, that shows the existing trees and the retention of those, which start to form this language of elliptical, soft landscape pieces, which start to frame the harder landscape pieces. There is open space here that's designed to be mixed use and flexible, and try to lend as much life to the emerging building design as possible. So this envisages both a place that's on the way somewhere, so this is both a connecting space, but it's also about trying to slow people down and create a successful space in of itself. Martin's already talked about the wind and solar exposure, but fair to say that the windiest part of the site is also the sunniest part of the site, which is one of the challenges we're faced. But with the articulation of the building and the openings that's been created, we've actually managed to get some sunshine into the upper part of the site. Obviously, that changes throughout the year. So we've adopted an informal approach to retention of those trees. We tested all sorts of approaches to how formal this space is, and we adopted this informal approach of soft landscape islands, something that is evocative of a waterside location, and that runs into pretty much everything in terms of the approach we're taking. So these soft landscapes are, where possible, bold in order to try and collect as much of the rainwater as possibly can, but they're also designed with nature and biodiversity in mind. So we're looking at is a functional, an engineered soft landscape rather than something that's merely visual amenity. Next slide, please. Okay, just moving on to the Muse space, which is about 570 square meters. It's currently a backyard site, really. It extends, it's a very narrow route that's about 13 meters wide that passes from north to south. It's an informal route, but it's a route that not many people legitimately use. And then you have a building which is approximately, the facade is approximately 13 meters away from the boundary. And then there's a 5-meter garden within that space as well. So it's currently a fairly disused and possibly attracts antisocial behaviour. So it's effectively an exercise in widening that space, creating a new north-south link, which joins up with the proposed crossing that goes over Seven Sisters Road. And there's an additional crossing to the south, which crosses Woodbury Down, and it's also an address to 4 of the units which look out onto that space. It's a very important piece of the play strategy as well. There's some very large retained trees in that, in the centre of that will lend it almost immediate character upon completion. Just a couple of views. The first view is looking south, and the next view is looking north. You can see play clustered around the mature trees in the centre. On that view too, on the right hand side, you've got a large piece of rain garden that separates the dwellings from the public space, and then on the left hand side you've got the boundary with St Olave's, and there's a series of mature trees and a group of mature trees down there that aren't accurately captured in this, but there will be quite a lot of retained greenery in that space. Next slide. Just looking at Seven Sisters Road briefly, Martin set out very distinctive formality across there, and this landscape follows those principles with soft landscape which retains as many of the trees along there as possible. People who know the site know there's some very mature trees along there, and a lot of those trees are going to be retained and form entrances to the new building. So we're adopting a somewhat defensive approach, and it's really the space is about protecting the ground floor residential units from that busy road, which will be busy and smelly for the foreseeable future until traffic starts to clean itself up a little bit. But really, this is we've taken a fairly formal approach to this, which is in contrast to what we've done in most of the places on the plan. And then just moving up onto the podium, it's about 3,600 square meters, just under 3,700 square meters. And it's effectively a mix of natural landscape types and distinctly programmed types, which include large amount of play. So effectively what we're trying to do is leverage the spaces which will receive most light. It'll be a southern light that comes from the bottom of this page shining upwards, north to the north upwards on this page. So you get these fairly generous openings, and then bands of sunlight passing across the site throughout the day, and we try to exploit those as much as possible with the main program spaces. And in between those, there's much more. There's moments of more intimate spaces, and each of that is linked via this sort of curving spine path, which links one side of the podium to the other. There's also growing opportunities on the site as well. Yep, next slide. There's a couple of views which just show a tightening up of landscape in the middle, creating a woodland space, if you like, in between the two glades, where I referred to try to collect as much of that sunlight as possible. So just trying to exploit the natural opportunities of both shade and the sunlight offered by the building openings. Next slide, please. There's currently 80 trees on the site, and we're looking at retaining 43 of those. That's a mixture of qualities. A lot of those are clearly retained around the edges of the site. We are looking at, they're currently proposed, about 97 trees are proposed. So it's a net gain in terms of the trees. Just in terms of the trees that are on site at the moment, there is 1 grade A, there's 17 grade Bs, 59 grade Cs, and 2 Us. Next slide. Okay, just to cover play, there's play at all levels. We are following closely Hackney's child-friendly spaces, and we're looking to get play into pretty much every part of this site. But the majority of that is on the podium. There is effectively the GLA recommends for a unit mix and number of this size. It's 1,700 square meters of play. Our focus is on the 0 to 12 age group, and we're achieving 1,400. It's envisaged that the older groups, so 12 to 17, will be dealt with off-site in other parts of the plan and with areas that are already existing and accessible. Next slide. Okay, this just shows a fairly complicated tapestry looking drawing, just shows the assessment for the urban greening factor. And we're currently achieving a minimum of 0.4, which meets the GLA requirements. Next slide.
And just to conclude this section, there's this slide on cultural opportunities, which has been developed through our work with DPQ, who have done quite a bit of research in the local estate. They've held a series of workshops trying to find out what are things that are important to creating the identity, and that's creating the identity, wrong word, building on the identity of Woodbury Down. And as part of that work, we have identified a number of opportunities within phase 4. Now, these aren't set proposals at this stage, but they are things that we will look to develop through the application and beyond to make sure that the design of Woodbury Down is one that is local and specific. And those opportunities range from things like the building signage that we've already talked about, and there are some examples in the bottom left of this image of community-led artwork used on a different estate in London, but to build something that is specific, through to opportunities for public art, both around the building in locations like the boundary with St Olave's Church, where we have a rather negative boundary at the moment. There's a real opportunity to do something more with it, through to the design of Central Square itself, be that from opportunities around seating or murals within that space that we can add a local distinctive quality to its design. And just to end this evening, so a couple of slides on sustainable design. I won't talk to Berkeley's priorities in particular, but there is a set of a vision for how Barclays as a company are leading towards 2030 and carbon targets therein. But to talk a bit about the specifics of phase 4, and not only how it is sustainable from a design point of view, but also what it's doing for the wider estate. So for those who've been involved in the estate, the estate has an energy network being developed in with it, a large part of which is the energy centre that sits within phase 3. That was developed at a point of time where gas CHP was very much the leader in sustainable technology. Things have somewhat moved on. So how phase 4 now contributes to that, there will be a series of air source heat pumps which are located on the buildings in phase 4 that will deliver low carbon heat, both for phase 4 itself, but also for all of the existing phases of the estate. So they are contributing to the decarbonisation of the KSS sites and phases 1 and 2. That builds on the other aspects of the design. I've talked a little bit about how the development does achieve net zero. The specifics of it is roughly a 48% carbon reduction achieved through a mixture of measures on site, through high energy high performance fabric, which reduces energy at demand, through to the air source heat pumps as a heating strategy, and to things like PV, which we're using for on the roofs on site for local energy generation. That really is part of the energy and the carbon side of it, but is also built on by all of the landscape working that Mark's done and delivering of a scheme which is very green and achieves something like a 20% net biodiversity increase on the site itself. And I think that's the end of our presentation for this evening. So over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Nasi, would you lights up? So thank you. Great. So committee, I thought it might be worthwhile attempting again to take it in themes rather than sort of person by person on anything you fancy, because it's quite a big one, obviously. So tenure is obviously a big thing. Design, take that as you will in terms of design, unit design, building design, outdoor space is one, sustainability, I've got something on car parking that sort of fits outside. Are there any other broad areas, or are you happy for us to sort of try?
I just wondered if we could take the podium as one
Yeah,
topic.
yeah. Can I say the podium and outdoor space as something in that area? So sort of the second bit. Yeah, okay. We'll do podium, play spaces, or outdoor space in that second one. Great. Okay.
Sorry
yep.
to interject. Could I just ask for the presentation slides just to come off? So it's just that obviously people who are watching on YouTube are still seeing the slides, so we should be all right now. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
applicants, could you arrange amongst yourselves if there's someone in particular to answer the questions? I won't know who to direct it to, and nor will the committee. So if you can direct yourselves, that would be great. Thank you. Let's kick off on tenure then. So I saw, yeah. So anyone else on tenure? Councillor Young, yeah. Okay. Great. Okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentations. So my question to you guys, the applicants, bearing in mind that this is what was formerly a council estate where the priority was social housing, and the original idea back in the 90s, a long time ago now, but the original idea was to actually increase the amount of social housing on this estate. 90 units representing less than 20% of what you're planning to build in phase 4 is really disappointing. So my first sort of specific question is, what is the loss of social tenancy? How does that figure of 90 compare to the existing numbers of social housing in that space? Thank you.
Great. Applicants. Thank you, Councillor Joseph.
Sean's going to answer this one.
Yes, hello there. My name's Sean Tickle from Multitude Planning. We're the planning consultants for the development. Obviously, this is an estate regeneration scheme, and therefore policy HA to the London Plan is very much applicable to this. So it's what we're looking at is not just an estate regeneration in terms of phase 4, but obviously the wider estate regeneration of Woodbury Down, which has been going on since 2006, I think 2007. There was obviously an original master plan which the council introduced, and the approach has always been to have a replacement of social rented accommodation, and also offering for leaseholders as well. And obviously we can, Barclay and the Regen team are here as well, so they can obviously input into that. But the approach has always been to make sure that we are replacing social rented accommodation with social rented accommodation. So in phase 4, the people who are living in phase 4 at the moment, the social rented tenants at the moment, they're not moving back into phase 4. They're actually moving into phase 3, which is already under construction at the moment. And in fact, phase 5, which will follow, will actually move into phase 3 as well. So the tenants who are moving into phase 4 will be coming from phases 6 and 7. So it's a much wider phased approach to how you introduce the social rented. And obviously there's been a housing needs survey taken of all the existing tenants as well as leaseholders as well. So there's a mixture of obviously tenants and leaseholders that are in the accommodation across Woodbury Down. So the approach has been here to target who needs to go into from phases 6 and 7, who needs to come into the accommodation, and that's why we've got the 90 units. There is then the additional affordable homes which are provided as shared ownership, and then the additional market, but we're providing in total for just over 40%, 44% as affordable. So the approach is not just that we're looking at an individual site on its own, we have to look at the wider approach to Woodbury Down.
I mean, I understood that as a baseline, you were supposed to be re-providing the social rent in each phase. And as I understand it, the figure I've got is that there's 158 social rented homes in that phase. So that's quite a significant loss, which I'd be quite concerned about, because as you say, it's a very long scheme. I think it actually started in the late 90s and it's not due to finish for about another 13 years. I could be wrong. I'm sure Councillor Young could correct me, but that's a long time. So how are we meant to keep track of you re-providing these social rent homes? You know, maybe I might not be sitting here in 15 years, neither might you.
I mean, obviously we take an assessment and survey of each phase, And there is a sort of requirement within the previous master plan, which was 2014, as Martin was mentioning, to have sort of position statements for each of the phases. So there is a sort of calculation of going forward and looking forward as to how we're replacing social rented accommodation. And eventually there will be additionality here, because of course all of the tenants will be moved from phases into new accommodation, into better, larger accommodation. And then there will be additionality in terms of social rented accommodation. So overall, there will be significant improvements in both social rented and leaseholder accommodation, and shared ownership accommodation as you go through the phases. It's very difficult to look at one individual phase on its own and just treat it as in isolation.
Could I just ask a question of Catherine or Natalie, whoever wants to take it? Obviously, previously we've, in the last pre-app, we looked at this phase plus the master plan. At the moment, we're looking at this phase only, and presumably this phase will come to the planning committee in the future on that basis. So we have H8 in the London plan. We've got the 50% target policy in the Hackney local plan. So what, on the basis that there is a master plan, but is that relevant or not relevant to this particular sort of planning application? Because usually we would look at an application as it is in front of us.
Indeed, as with most things to do with Woodbury Down, it's complicated. This will be a standalone planning application, but you can't really assess it without considering the wider context. That having been said, the GLA have been pretty clear that they will not accept a portfolio approach in this particular instance, and they will be looking for reprovision on site. I could continue for quite something.
And this does go to the GLA after we've looked at it. With this phase will go to the GLA after we've seen it as a planning committee in the future.
That's correct. It's a referable scheme.
So I hope that's useful context for everyone. Councillor Joseph, did you have a follow-up or?
Oh, I'm glad. I'm very glad. Because it's a very long scheme, and there's no way that we can really assess what's going to happen in that many years' time. It needs to be re-provided. That's the housing that we need in Hackney. It's the housing that exists on the site. Another question on tenure, if I may, the shared ownership aspect. Maybe you can clarify some of the prices for us. I mean, it is officially classed as affordable housing. It's very, very much at the top of that scale. And I know residents have expressed concern about who's actually going to be able to afford to live in those. Is that why they're only 1 and 2 bedrooms in terms of size?
The bottom right white button usually. But there you go.
There we go, that'll do. Yes, you're correct. There is just 1 and 2 bedroom shared ownership homes on the site. We've taken advice from Notting Hill Genesis on the basis that the 3 bedrooms would be unaffordable, but I think that's symptomatic of Hackney, because you've become a sort of more popular and more expensive borough, and unfortunately 3 bedroom homes are not falling within the criteria of being able to be sold within the affordability category. So yes, we have only got 1 and 2 bedroom shared ownership properties on Woodbury Down. But that's actually recognised in your policy as a sort of symptomatic thing across Hackney. Just going back a bit further, the original PDA was set up on the premise that there is shared ownership on Woodbury Down because the council didn't actually want a mono-tenure development. So that's why we have social rented, shared ownership and private. And that was sort of embedded and baked in at the beginning of the PDA. So I understand the point and the drive and the current move towards more social rented, but that wasn't quite where the regeneration of Woodbury Down started. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Councillor Young, then Councillor Potter, then Councillor Sadek.
Can I just build a little bit on the 3 bedroom question? So I've had a few questions sent, which have been sent to all planning committee members from Woodbury Down Community Organisation, and you will all be aware of these questions already. One of the things that they've raised is this question about the 1-2 bedroom and the lack of 3 bedroom, which raises a real concern about families, both existing families on the estate and also families who might move onto the estate, and where they would find affordable accommodation on the estate. So the concern is that if we can't provide 3 bedroom homes that are affordable, then how can we say that this estate is, is affordable and is providing for the community as a whole? What they say is, therefore, why can't we have a higher percentage of truly affordable properties as required by the 2011 London Plan, which I know is not the current London Plan, the 2021 London Plan, and 50%, which would be our starting point, of course, for this phase, and also the master plan going forward. So yes, we're looking at this phase on its own. We're also looking ahead to more social homes in future phases, but why are we not providing more truly affordable homes in this phase for the people who, for the families that exist on the estate?
I suppose it's a difficult one. We are currently building phase 3, where we have 3 bedroom shared ownership properties coming forward. So there will be some on that phase. Just in terms of the total proportion of affordable, I think Sean mentioned earlier, we're at 44% by unit, which is actually quite good. And I think just in terms of the challenge that we all face in terms of viability, it's going to be a struggle. The phase is ultimately, it's a cross subsidy of private sale that brings forward the social rented, and so it will come through the viability assessment as to what can be provided on the site. So it's difficult. And also by habitable rooms, we're up to 40. By habitable rooms, we're at 49, 45, 49%. Quite high.
Yeah, I noticed there's a distinction between habitable rooms and units in the presentation. I suppose, Catherine, what's the policy on habitable versus units, and what's I get the sense that units is what mostly is in planning, but if you could just give us a quick run through those two, that distinction, that'd be really helpful.
There are a number of different metrics against which the delivery of affordable housing can be quantified, which are set out pretty clearly in the London Plan, which include habitable rooms, bedrooms per hectare, units per hectare, and there's also flexibility to use floor space when you're considering re-provision of social housing. In the local plan, the Hackney's LP33, it's by unit and bed, units number and bed numbers. But there is some flexibility built in. In terms of the figures that have been put forward by the pre-applicant, if that makes sense, yes, there is a high proportion of habitable rooms, but that is largely due to the fact that the social rent accommodation is largely provided as having separate living, dining areas and kitchens are, for the purposes of the London Plan, considered to be habitable rooms, whereas in market and shared ownership, it's more like there's a high proportion of properties with a shared living, kitchen, dining area, which means that number is slightly skewed towards the social rented accommodation, which is why in this case there's a higher proportion in comparison to the actual gross number of units.
So just to be really clear about the numbers, yes, there's quite a decent percentage, whatever it is, 44% of affordable. We were talking about re-provision. How many social homes were there on this estate when the project started, and how many social rented homes will there be at the end of the project?
When we first started this project, let's say there are 200 units at the moment on phase 4 that will be demolished. Of those,
200 units, 41 of them are leasehold properties that were purchased under right to buy. In addition, the council have a policy of buying back leasehold properties out of phase. And on this particular phase, we've purchased 15 properties out of phase. So in total, from sort of in terms of the original 200 units, there have been, of those 200 units, there have been 41 leasehold properties and 15 out of phase leasehold properties. So in fact, that would make 144 units of social accommodation, social rented. I think what's fair to say is because we have identified through the Housing Needs Survey a requirement for much larger family units, that has resulted in less units being developed because the units are so much larger. I know when Barclays first approached us and said, well, you know, you're predicting, I think we were predicting 84 units as a result of the master plan on phase 4. And Barclays turned around and goes, no, it's going to be far more like 100 units for social rent on that particular site. But because we changed the mix and required larger family units, that reduced the total number of units of social rent to 90. So we were building, you know, smaller units, you know, more 2 beds and 1 beds, then you know, there would be more units developed. But actually what we're doing with the social rent in these initial phases is trying to accommodate the housing needs of the existing residents.
Councillor Young?
Just on the larger number of larger properties, there's been a housing needs survey which has identified a number of families that need larger properties. How confident are you that you know how many larger properties we need? And by larger, I mean 3 and above, 3 bedrooms and above, and that we are re-providing enough both for the existing residents on the estate and for future need?
It's not my place to say how confident we are, but I have, with good authority from our housing needs section, that what we're providing is going to meet the housing need. And a lot of those large families, bearing in mind at the moment we're talking about a scheme that won't be finished until 2028, and those large families now may well be smaller families at that time, or there may be more large numbers. The housing needs survey also is, because it's being assessed, it's a self-completing survey. You know, once our housing needs people get to verify the applicants, you know, some of these larger families are actually multi-generational families, and so they are confident that the figures that we are demonstrating will be the figures or the numbers that we.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Potter, Councillor Sadek, Councillor Joseph. Councillor Potter first.
Thank you, Chair. My question again relates to the number of social rented units. So back to the original premise Councillor Joseph brought up. And I thought Councillor Young was asking my question, but she didn't get the answer that I was expecting. So maybe. So in terms of the original premise that the area was going to be regenerated, but at least the same and more social rent units were going to be provided. How are we doing in an approximate way? And I know it's not exact because the numbers do change. How are we doing in providing the number of social rented that we originally envisaged, and how, as far as you can answer in this current time, because providing 90 to replace 144 sounds like further schemes we're going to have almost 80% of social ready to achieve that original objective, which sounds to me, it doesn't sound credible given the difficulties you're facing at the moment in terms of viability and social rent. So it'd be good to have a good, honest answer about whether we're actually going to make that number of social rented homes realistically.
It's quite loud now. I think I sort of answered it earlier, which is when you originally started or the council entered into the development agreement, your actual aim was not to re-provide all the social rented homes. It was to not have a mono-tenure estate. And actually, that's where we started. that the move to replace the social rented is now a different aspiration, but we are 15 years into the regeneration scheme. So I understand the drive for social rented. We are in a contract whereby we are required to undertake a house, or the council undertake a housing needs survey, and we re-provide the housing required for decant, because ultimately people in future phases need to move in. But that was always offset with the sort of the social rented and shared ownership balance, which we are still delivering. But in terms of numbers, we are 2,317 homes built to date, of which, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, 537 of them are social rented. And I'll find it somewhere. But yes, we're 2,317 built and occupied as of today. There's another 117 social rented coming forward on phase 3. And there'll be 90 on phase 4. But as Nicola's said, although there's 19% or 90 units of social rented and 119 of shared ownership, the shared ownership are very small and the social rented are very large. So actually on a floor space basis, they're very similar. It's just that the size of the cake is cut up in different sort of slices. But we can come back on the numbers.
I suppose the mixed tenure aspect is something the council's been driving for quite a long time, so I can quite appreciate that. But I think at the same time, they were still saying they wanted the same number of socially rented with a mixed tenure approach. So, I mean, that's my understanding. So was that realistic at the time, or has that become less realistic as time has gone on? Because I think we need to be kind of honest and open about this, you know, when we're having these conversations. I don't think the number of social rent has been replaced by the fact by mixed tenure. I think the argument was for mixed tenure and that number of social rent.
I just think it's fair to say that times have changed, and actually we are increasing the number of social rented each time we make an application is more than we had approved at the master plan. So I'm not sure whether we'll ever get that sort of over in terms of social rented, because viability wise it might not work, because it's a different model from how the scheme was originally envisaged. But rest assured, it's one of the key objectives of the partnership going forward to the master plan is to actually increase the number of social rented properties as we can. And I mean, for example, we've increased from 84 to 90 on phase 4. Phase 3, well, the numbers, it was 117, but it was a lot less. It was about 80 something, I think, in 64. So it went up significantly on phase 3. And I think each phase will become slightly more dense. And as it becomes more dense, it gives us more opportunity to develop further social rented units.
Okay, Councillor Sadek.
The question I was going to ask has been attacked by 2 other councillors now, but I think there's still a little bit left in it. Just on that point there about you've exceeded the proportion of social rent on what was in the master plan. I'm new to this committee, so I just wondered if, when you refer to the master plan, is that for each phase, or was there an original sort of master plan for the whole thing at the outset? And if the latter, what was that initial proportion that was anticipated across the whole regeneration as a percentage for social rent?
I think the original master plan, which was 2008, was I think 41% in total of affordable. But as Jamie was mentioning before, that wasn't based on a social rent replacement. It was based on a mixed tenure approach. Obviously, Policy H8 has come in during this process, and we've now got a slightly different metric that we have to meet. There was a 2014 master plan as well, which upped the number of total residential units and also increased the affordable division to about 42% across each phase. But each phase doesn't have to achieve that. The objective is by phase 8, we will have achieved all of that, and we will be achieving the additionality that we will get. And just to say, just in terms of these numbers, we will be submitting with the application, and obviously it's something that we will investigate, the numbers of units within each phase that we've got to so far. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, looking at the existing buildings and how many sort of existing units we've got and what we're replacing. So that information will be with the application.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I get the 41% on affordable housing across the development has changed, and the makeup of the tenure has changed along the way, and the rules have changed by the sound of it. But was there not any specification at the outset then on social rent, a subcategory of the affordable rent bit? Yeah, well, I suppose in 2014.
I mean, I'd have to go back to see what the original figures were in sort of from 2008 and 2014, what the overall total percentages were. But I don't have that information in front of me. I do apologize.
Okay, no problem, thanks. And then a slightly different question, again, possibly from my understanding as someone that's new to the committee, it's just I noticed for this phase that you've spread the tenure across different blocks. I just wondered if is that consistently the case across, so you wouldn't have one block that is mixed tenure? No.
No, the management for sort of housing is better to have individual blocks run. So, for example, we would keep the social rented in a single block, because then that could be run by Notting Hill Genesis and keep the service charge lower. But pepper potting's not the best way to manage schemes, so we would try and keep the tenures to at least a block. We have on phase 3 that you've previously approved, we do put to make sure the numbers balance. We have got instances where we've got social rented around the bottom of buildings, so that you can have mixed tenure, but you can lower service charge. So it's always, we take these things through our design committee to make sure that we can mix and integrate people, but the whole development will be tenure blind, so you won't be able to tell where people live. So that's sort of how you kind of make it work in the best way.
So Joseph next.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm still not letting it go. Just to come back to that, so 144 social homes you concede exist there now, but you feel this may, you know, a reduction might be justified if there are more bedrooms. So we need to know the figures. We need to be precise. So how many, do you know how many bedrooms, how many 2 beds are there at the moment? How many 3 beds in comparison to what's being proposed? Could we just find out those figures, please?
We know how many 1 beds and 2 beds and 3 beds there are in the existing. I don't have those figures right in front of me, but we obviously can provide that with the application.
Quite important to know if you wanted us to approve it, because if you're saying that you're increasing the size, we'd need to see the evidence.
Just to say that a lot of the existing units are a lot smaller than the proposed units, because what we're providing is Parkham Eyes plus 10%, which is much bigger than the national technical standards and the London Plan standards. The existing building survey that's been undertaken of the 6 blocks that are there at the moment indicate that all of the units are generally much smaller than national technical standards. So we are replacing, whilst we might be replacing all the unit numbers, we are replacing more accommodation. So there is a balance there in terms of floor space as well as unit numbers.
Yeah, 1 second. I was just make a point on Parkham Rise plus 10. So my previous experience that in new developments has been that residents still don't feel actually their usable space is increased all that much. That's partly due to new standards around sort of wider corridors and things like that. So I think the design of the floor plates and the actual units is really, really important, because actually, you know, about where you put your furniture, how you use the usable space is really important to people, obviously. And simply saying Parkham Rise plus 10 and saying, you know, the floor space is bigger, and that may not necessarily be how it feels to residents and when they actually use it, I find. Councillor Young.
So last point on sort of viability and then the master plan as a whole. If it is not viable to build more social homes in this phase, why will it be more viable to build more social homes in later phases? And sort of in addition to that, so we're looking at this phase on its own to an extent, but as the planning officer says, we can't really look at it in a vacuum because we know there's a master plan and we've seen the master plan. So can this committee say, well, in future, we want more social housing in the next master plan, or we want to look at, you know, when we're looking at the master plan and its development for the next phase, we won't be happy unless there will be more social housing as a proportion of, whether that's more in numbers or whether that's more as a proportion of the affordable housing section for the future.
Who's your question for? I suppose the way you framed it is sort of for us, but not the applicant, I think. What do you?
The why will it be more viable, I suppose, is for Barclays, because viability is Barclays. And the master plan really is, you know, for everybody concerned, because we're all part of the master plan process.
And I suppose it's largely a question about the viability of this scheme, isn't it? So, I mean, have the viability reports been submitted yet? Is it gone through viability assessment? No.
No, not yet. We will submit an FEA as part of the planning application, but I suppose, yeah, the viability for phase 4 is challenging. Okay, that's the best way to put it for now. And so I think it's probably best to see how challenging it is for the officer to see it, and then make an assessment on what level of affordable housing would be reasonable for this site. And that's probably the best way to do it in terms of a policy approach. We understand what the policy is, and we will get as close to it as we can in the context of viable world.
I suppose what I'm saying is why do we think it will be more viable to build more social housing in future phases than it is now? So if what we're doing is pushing back the larger amounts of, so we know we've got to deliver more social housing than we're currently delivering, well, that would be the policy. And what we're doing is we're pushing it back into the later phases. Well, if it's not viable now, why is it going to be viable in those phases?
I think the economy is fairly cyclical. The economy at the moment, I think even on council schemes, you're probably struggling to make them work yourselves. Build costs have gone up at a spectacular rate, and that's not been, it's gone up in a sort of commensurate way with housing costs. And so at the moment, viability is extremely challenging. It has not always been that case, and so there will be cyclical movements in the economy over the time and the duration of this regeneration scheme. And just, I suppose the other question is, or the question earlier was that the regeneration is sort of scheduled to go on until 2035.
Okay, so I think we is it on a slightly different? I think we've sort of given this a run over, but okay, go ahead.
Well, it's just a question really. Like, I just wanted to understand. So as I understand it, the original social rent on Woodbury Down was 1,327, with the remainder having been bought under the Right to Buy scheme. So if you don't replace all of that social housing, where do those people go? What's going to happen? Just a curiosity there.
As we move people from one phase to another, let's start again. From 1999, when the first proposals for Woodbury Down were approved by Cabinet, there was a freeze on new tenancies. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're rehousing the existing tenants that were secure tenants from 1999. All the vacancies and all the voids going forward, instead of being granted new secure tenancies, they've gone to temporary tenants and temporary licenses. So in fact, when we get to phase 5, we will have rehoused all of the existing tenants. So phases 6, 7 and 8 will have social rented homes which will be available for housing waiting list tenants.
It's a shame for that community, really, isn't it? So they've essentially been quite dispersed.
No, the community are staying. The existing tenants, all the existing tenants on Woodbury Down have got a right to return. And the majority of them have. I mean, I think it's something like 96% have returned or will return to Woodbury Down. They move from one, no, they don't, they move once, but they move from one phase to another. So for example, phase 3 at the moment has 117 social rented units. And all of phase 4, because we have 40 tenants, secure tenants left on phase 4, they will all move into phase 3. 70 tenants from phase 5 will move in. So that's all of the tenants from say phase 5, which leaves, I'll get my math right, but it's about 16 or so will be coming from phase 6. So they will all be moved within the estate. So phase 4, the tenants will be coming from phases 6 and phase 7. And so we anticipate, if you look at just numbers, I mean, that's all I can do at the moment. You know, they are real people, but the numbers actually show that by the time we've finished phase 5, we will have decanted all of the existing tenants on the estate, assuming they,
Rehomed,
they
anyway.
choose to move back.
Sorry, I had Councillor Desmond first before.
There's a couple of tangential things that I want to raise. We had an email from former councillor Stopps on the.
Can we stay on tenure, please?
Stay on what?
Stay on tenure, please.
All right, let me know when you're on transport.
I will do. Thank you. And then I had Councillor Sado, then I had Councillor Potter.
I was just going to come in on that exchange, just to make sure I've understood correctly, because the pool of council tenants that you made very clear, everyone that needs to be rehomed within the estate will be. From 2006 or whenever it began, that is a shrinking pool of people. So you, at the same time as being able to deliver for everyone that wants a home and has the right to a home from Woodbury Down in the new regeneration, it's possible to deliver on that whilst having a potentially significantly lower overall stock of social housing without any individual having lost out, but still falling short of any aspiration, whether or not it was documented or a formal commitment was made. The aspiration for lots of people, as we understand it at the beginning, was like for like or additionality, to use the term that's being used tonight. So just to make sure that is, have I understood that correctly?
Yes, so just one slight little nuance involved there is actually you talk about it being a shrinking amount of tenants. Well, actually, there's a small amount of growing tenants as well, because we have a very attractive local lettings policy, which enables the adult children of existing tenants to have their own tenancy. It's called a split household policy. And to date, I'm not sure how many, I haven't got the data of how many households, additional households we've rehoused, but I'm confident and I know sort of anecdotally, having talked to a lot of the tenants that are moving into phase 3, that some of them are families that resulted from a split household. So, they are the grown-up children have now become young families. So, it is a smaller pot, but actually there are some increases there as well.
Okay, Councillor Potter.
I was just going to point out that I was aware that particularly in the first phases, quite a lot of the residents had to resettle elsewhere because you didn't have any buildings to move into, and then they didn't come back because they'd obviously changed their lives, restructured their lives, children started new schools, etc., etc. So I think from the earlier phases, quite a lot of tenants didn't use the right to.
Yeah, I suppose that's less relevant for this pre-app, Councillor Potter.
I know, but it just kind of feeds into the overall context. I still don't think the numbers stack up that are being presented. It seems like the pool of social tenants is shrinking, and we're relying on the fact that the pool of the original tenants, the numbers shrank, I think. So I'm just going to point
Okay,
that out.
I think we've given this a good run through. We're in the context that we have 14,500 people on the housing waiting list in Hackney. 3,500 of those are in temporary accommodation, aren't they? We want to see a growing pool of social housing, in particular, within that affordable kind of mix. That's backed up by policy, both at HA within London Plan and then within the local plan as well. So I think, you know, you've heard our thoughts on that. This is a pre-app meeting. I think we've given that a good run through. So food for thought, the applicants there, I think. So if we move on, if there's nothing else on tenure in terms of, we've given it a good run through with the shared ownership as well. We can move on to design, unit design, buildings design, tower design, that kind of thing. Any comments, questions? Councillor Young, I see that.
I wanted to ask about the design of the blocks along Seven Sisters Road. As you know, there's been a bit of concern about the blocks along, so at the moment, the blocks along Seven Sisters Road there are gaps between them, not there. And the proposals for the new blocks, and it was a good picture of it, I think, in the north-facing picture that you showed. They're a bit of a kind of canyon, so it's a, you know, it feels a bit of a solid line along. And there have been concerns raised by existing residents that this creates, that there's a sort of lack of permeability in this new design. Can you just talk to us a little bit about why and whether there are options for having gaps between the buildings rather than this kind of solid line, and linked to that, that they're very so you talked about the air quality. The feeling is these are very close to the road, very close to Seven Sisters Road, not set back that far, and that will affect people's the air quality and people's sense of the air quality.
I'll start with the air quality and then I'll go back to the other one. So our air quality assessments have now been undertaken as part of the EIA that will be forthcoming for the application. What that is showing us that while conditions adjacent to the road are, it's a busy road and there are not great conditions at pavement level, the setback to the buildings is sufficient to mean that the air quality at the facade line is actually aligned with the standards. There are no implications in terms of opening windows. At that point, it's perfectly fine. So the air quality, the studies will show that it's not a position due to the setback, a problem due to the setback of the building. The figures that we talked about earlier, bearing in mind that building line does step. So the figures that we gave you for the closest pass, and then the linking sections between the main peaks are further about 2.5 to 3 meters further set back from that. So you do have a good frontage that separates the building from the road itself, and as will be shown, air quality we don't believe is an issue, and that will be backed up by reports. In terms of the continuity of the building, we started off, as I say, we've been led very much by developing an approach which is environmental led and developed through studies of daylight, sunlight, and all of those things. What we've found is that placing a greater amount of mass on Seven Sisters Road, where you do have a very generous street. I mean, it's 40 meters from building frontage to building frontage. So we're talking about a scale of street here, which can take taller buildings. That actually, by putting more apartments, more accommodation on that street, that allows us the benefit of opening up the south side. So those gaps between the buildings on the south, which allow you to respond to that type of street and to allow sunlight and daylight into the plot and to benefit those that are living on the north side, facing in a southerly direction. If we were to move away from that, bearing in mind that for many reasons we need to deliver this quantity of housing on the site, we would have to take those apartments and place them elsewhere. That would be done at the cost of additional height or infilling the gaps between the buildings. So it is a balance here that we're trying to seek, that balancing the quality of the accommodation against the kind of physical mass of the buildings. And we think we're striking it quite well. In terms of permeability, while you can't get through the site in the middle, we are going back to those original points about where the routes are and where they're trying to stitch into, based in terms of the current public spaces to the south and those forthcoming to the north. we do achieve permeability where it's really critical, where through the central square or through the space that Mark explained on St Olave's Church. And that ties into the work that's being done on Seven Sisters Road in terms of crossing positions and make sure that that permeability is valuable and leads you on to other spaces on the north. There was, I think, in the note that we received from Woodco, concern about would this happen on both sides of the road? And when you looked at phase 6, for example, would we be looking to do the same? That has to be developed, and we'll have to come back to you with the master plan. But the work that we've done on it so far is that it won't be the same on the north. There are some different criteria there, particularly to do with retained housing that faces onto Woodbury Grove North, which have different impacts in terms of their sunlight levels and their amenity, which would actually judge that lead us towards a more broken form with gaps in between on the north. So it's not something that is, as it's happening here, is necessarily going to be reflected elsewhere.
I wonder if we could have the picture up so that we can see.
I
what
can
we're
share it
talking
again.
about.
Yeah.
You see the lights without, can you see the screen without the lights being dimmed? Or would you like them to be dimmed?
Is it this one or the ground level view you were after?
You had a view which was, I think, called north or something. So you had a north one and a south one, and the north one just showed how this was a sort of solid block along that side of Seven Sisters Road, and then you could see that. I mean, obviously, we're not now considering what's going to happen on the south side, but the assumption from your pictures was that the south side would look different.
Might be the aerial view.
Despite everything you've said, I'm not sure I completely understand why there can't be any gaps between these buildings, which would allow for kind of people to travel between them and just feel less canyony. That's it. Yeah, that's without losing significant numbers of homes.
The other thing to bear in mind is, I suspect one of the other questions we're going to come to on the podium. So I don't know if you want to deal with that now or later on. Right, we'll leave that one for later. But clearly the provision of a podium does affect the ability to transit through the site.
Sorry, explain that to me. So where's the podium, but why does it have an impact on the
So if I go to
these
the
four
ground
blocks?
floor plan. So because the centre of the site is occupied by that, largely by parking provision for the residents, the gardens above are at first floor level, and so you couldn't get a street level break between the buildings.
Okay, great. Councillor Potter and then Councillor Desmond, your question that might be useful in this phase after this. Is that all right? Councillor Potter. Microphone, please. Thank you.
So page 17 and officers' comments in 5.15. So you say, well, the layouts are legible and appear to meet the minimum space accessibility standards. There's uncertainty as to whether the accommodation will as a whole provide an adequate standard in relation to light, cross ventilation and heating. So I was wondering, officers, whether you would be able to explain those comments more fully, and then over to the designers, and then back to officers would be useful.
Excuse me, I'm just getting the correct page up on my screen.
I know we've been providing some detailed kind of daylight and that kind of thing. I was wondering whether.
So page 17.
It's page 17 in the agenda pack, and it's 5.1 and 5.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry. Is this the officer report or the presentation pack?
The officer report.
Sorry.
Officer report.
I apologise. Could I possibly have a copy? I do apologise. I wrote it a while ago. 5.15. So.
In the middle of that paragraph, you talk about, there is uncertainty as to the adequate standard of accommodation in relation to light, cross ventilation and overheating.
Okay, well, if I could possibly just refer to cross ventilation and overheating first of all. You'll have seen from the floor plans that a lot of the units are technically dual aspect in that they satisfy the London Plan definition as having windows on outside corners of buildings. However, there is some concern that some of those units will be, although they are technically speaking, they satisfy that requirement, they will effectively, both of those aspects will be facing onto Seven Sisters Road, for example, or facing southwards. So it's not quite giving the level of cross ventilation and a differing outlook that you would expect from a more conventional through flow building, a unit that would have greater levels of cross ventilation. That obviously feeds into overheating, particularly with the south facing units. In terms of light, most of the units, I think officers are satisfied will probably achieve adequate standards. However, there is a pinch point in the western end of the site where there are it's the narrowest part of the site adjacent to St Olave's Church, where the buildings on the north and the south come very close together. There have been some mechanisms proposed to address that in terms of privacy and light, such as having false windows. But there's still some concern that the quality of accommodation in that part of the site may not be as high as we would normally expect, especially at lower levels. Having said that, the design has evolved since earlier in its gestation, and originally there was going to be a sort of U-shaped building at that point, and that has been removed, so it's only at duplex ground floor level along the actual western boundary, but there is still a very tight relationship between the buildings fronting onto Seven Sisters Road and onto Woodbury Down itself. As I say, it is very much only at that extreme end of the site though. Does that address you?
Response from the applicants?
Just a couple of points on that. One, I think at the point that this report was written, the technical reports hadn't been submitted to Catherine. Those things are being worked on with the design team, daylight and sunlight, overheating, acoustic criteria, and will be fully completed by the time the application will be made. I think a lot of the issues that Catherine talked about here are ones that we've been conscious of in developing design. We do have a pinch point, particularly that exists at the St Olave's end of the site, and we've looked to develop those properties around that area to respond to that. That goes from a number of means, like putting the cores on the north side of the building in the areas where the buildings are closest, making sure the flats that are at the narrowest point face outward, so the two flats at the narrowest point face towards St Olave's Church rather than facing across the gap. Making sure that we do have as a high percentage of dual aspect, that while we are in places using significant setbacks in the building to give that second aspect, we're talking about 3 meters of setback, so you do have a good and generous window on the return elevation on primary living spaces, even when the apartment is facing towards Seven Sisters Road. We are conscious of the acoustic environment around the site, and particularly those apartments that face Seven Sisters Road, and that often has an impact on overheating. The apartments are, as far as the technical analysis that's being done, they're achieving, they're not having an overheating issue. We're able to deal with that. The residents of those apartments won't have to open their windows. The apartments should stay cool without that. That is not to say they cannot open their windows. There is a choice there for them to do so. So in broad summary, I think the comment in the report is coming because the information hasn't been submitted. It is being done and completed, and it isn't showing to raise significant issues.
Okay, Councillor Desmond. Oh, yeah, sorry, Councillor Desmond.
Just back to Catherine. Sorry, I didn't address you properly before. Do we do so? Obviously, the developers have come up with a really detailed surveys around some of the issues we're concerned about the wind, sunlight, etc. Do we? And I know we do some work too to kind of verify that. How much work do we do to kind of, I don't know, check or quantify the, to provide some, validity to what the developers say?
This probably won't be a very satisfactory answer. Officers have a certain level of familiarity and competence and can do sense checks. If a document is submitted by an appropriately qualified person who has the correct professional accreditation, we generally have to take it on face value, what's been submitted. I would just say that some technical reports have been submitted and they do indicate poor light quality, for example, in some units. But I realise that they are the preliminary assessments and haven't been fully worked up. But yeah, just to clarify that point, and written comments have been provided in response to them.
It's a pre-app. I don't think we necessarily need to go through sort of back and forth on whether it does or does not now, right? So it's a concern on light. We don't have the sort of reports in front of us. So I think your question generally about sort of verifying it is fine. I wouldn't necessarily, unless you desperately want to come back on it.
Well, just to say, it's obviously it's an EIA, so there will be independent assessment of all of the technical and environmental reports of the EIA, of which daylight is one of them.
Okay, great. Drum roll for Councillor Desmond.
Yeah, so firstly, a few building questions before I come on to the issue of transport. Could you clarify, when building control signed off these buildings, Hackney's building control, this is prior to anyone moving in? Could you just clarify that?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, yes, building control will need to sign off the units before people move in. Yes.
It's fine. I thought that was the case, just check. The second thing, I've been seeing the new development going up and we can see the concrete. Are we sure that this concrete is of the quality it needs to be to avoid spalling in the future? I'm old enough, and of course I'm very young, but I'm old enough to remember in 1968 the appalling disaster at Ronan Point, where high alumina cement was used, and then afterwards everyone's blaming each other for not analysing the actual concrete. So are we sure that the concrete that is being used in these buildings is of the adequate quality that will last? And who would actually, is it building control who are responsible? Who is responsible for ensuring it is adequate?
I'm now straying into areas that are not my speciality, but I do know a little bit. And basically, every time a truckload of cement comes to site, you have to do a small sample test of the cement, and that's then tested, and I'll get the name of the thing, but it's basically strength tested to make sure it is the right cement for building.
All right, so I'm reassured to an extent on that, because, it's a critical thing. We must avoid spalling and any problems in the future. On the transport issue, now, I was in this chamber 15 years ago when Councillor Maureen Middleton said that if there were any changes to Seven Sisters Road, it would be over her dead body. Very sadly, she died 12 years ago. Former Councillor Vincent Stopps had a diametrically opposed view to former Councillor Maureen Middleton. Could I just ask when we're going to be able to consider what's happening regarding Seven Sisters Road, because it's a complex decision and TfL will have to be involved. So when will that be part of the application?
Sorry.
I can come back on that
Go
if you
on,
want.
Christine. So, Yeah, so I think if I might slightly rephrase it, the buildings that are facing north that are being built have balconies that, as we've already discussed, are all north facing, face onto Seven Sisters Road. It is at the moment a busy road. As part of the master plan, I believe there's money allocated already. That is quite a long frontage, right? It's a long frontage with a lot of residents that are going to be facing onto it. At the moment, their balconies, their north-facing balconies are north-facing and on a pretty busy and unreconstructed main road. So in terms of your design and your involvement, as I know you are in the working group on Seven Sisters Road, how is this all stitching together? Is that okay, Christine?
That's a very good way of putting it. Yes, so Seven Sisters Road and the narrowing of to reduce severance has been on the agenda for the master plan, and it was as part of the phase 3 application. There is money that has been allocated to fund a scheme to reduce the severance of Seven Sisters Road and create environmental improvements. So that money is safe. There is a working group with TfL. TfL are slightly under-resourced at the moment, but we are waiting for a new case officer to be allocated and those discussions to resume. So there is still discussion ongoing with that. Yes, so I was going to give you more information than you need, but so yes. The money is there, and there is every intention that will come forward and improvements will be made.
Okay. Can I ask just an additional question on Seven Sisters Road? So, which is relevant to this, you've got in this the green network and the routes down from essentially north south circulation, isn't it? Just on that, I suppose it is 1 to 2 to 3 around St Olave's Church. It looks like I think I'm allowed to do this. It looks like the route there is spilling out as it relates to 3, and you're creating a desire line across the road, but it looks like people have to turn left, walk up the road a little bit, and then cross the road into this phase. Is that right? Is there a crossing there, or?
So there is within the TfL proposals for Seven Sisters Road a crossing midway between Woodbury Grove and Manor House. The original 2014, it was actually aligned with St Olave's Church as you come down from the north. We have been talking to them about moving it to align with the phase 4 proposal. So as you come out of that space, you would cross Seven Sisters Road, and then yes, you would come along the pavement on the north side. That dogleg has always existed because of St Olave's Church. The proposals for the TfL proposals for Seven Sisters Road are not equal. The north side of the road is actually the one where they locate the cycle lane and a wider pavement with additional trees and protection to the street. So the proposal here, as it will be forthcoming in the master plan, is to focus pedestrian movement on that side where pedestrians are more protected.
Okay, great. I've got another question, but it leads on into the green stuff, but it is design, so I'll leave it to the last. So anyone? Councillor Joseph, Councillor Young.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's about the design, the outer design, I guess. So the original blocks, a lot of them had the kind of streets in the sky walkways where people walk past and maybe had a chat with their neighbours. And obviously there's quite a big social benefit of being able to see your neighbours. And talking to a few people I know who've moved into the new blocks, they described it more kind of hotel style, where you don't necessarily bump into your neighbours as much because you're inside and you don't have that shared communal walkway where the kids might play out and so on. So I know that you were giving a nod to the original design in terms of aesthetically, but I wonder if you actually consider kind of recreating those kind of external walkways which are quite popular with people in Hackney.
Yeah, they don't have a completely uncheckered history. There are issues with deck access housing, being outside, walking straight past people's front doors, privacy, although of course there are benefits of that element of communality. In terms of the proposed design, we have to look in other ways of delivering that. And I think what we've tried to do quite hard with the buildings is move away from kind of long linear corridors, which are kind of quite faceless, and have a kind of hotel quality. So that if you, when we were talking about the plans, there is a proposal within there to make sure that all of the entrances are clustered. So you do have a feeling for who your neighbour is, that you're coming out of a local zone where you are, you know, it is your grouping of entrances. The circulation spaces within the building are daylit, so they're not buried in a kind of unhospitable within inside the building. And then we also have to look for other opportunities. So around the building entrances, are there space to kind of wait and meet your neighbours in a kind of day-to-day basis? And so we have a focus around the entrances to the building, the lobbies, and the spaces as you're approaching the building, to make those opportunities for kind of day-to-day interaction. So yes, there are differences to the existing condition. As I say, it's not a perfect scenario either way, but we have thought about how that and how it can be embedded within the proposals that you've seen.
So Young.
Just wanted to follow up on that really on the deck access. It was really noticeable when you put up the pictures of the existing buildings, how much deck access there is on the old estate. And certainly I speak to residents a lot, and older residents in the new buildings say it feels lonely, which feels kind of quite sad really. So just to think about the positives of deck access, completely understand that they have a checkered history as well. I also wonder whether this contributes to the overheating concerns. Some of the newer buildings are extremely hot in the corridors, so I wonder whether deck access would also contribute to reducing the risk of overheating. And could you tell us a bit about what you're doing in the design of this phase to reduce the risk of overheating? And I'll come back on I've also got a wind tunnel question, but I'll come back on that.
So in terms of overheating, we do look at the communal areas in the building. They change a little bit depending on exactly which building, but there are openable windows, particularly in the Seven Sisters Road elevations, that we use to ventilation. We also have other methods of getting ventilation into those areas to ensure that they don't overheat. In terms of the apartments, of course, overheating is a bit of a we're driven towards creating apartments which are highly thermally efficient, so that people have to spend as little money as possible heating them. That comes with the side effect that actually it's quite difficult to get rid of the heat, and we know that to be an issue. What we've done here throughout is try and maximise the opening, the size of the opening windows throughout. And so it goes also to kind of service charge. And so you can actually clean your windows from the inside, but you also get big areas where you can open and get ventilation through the apartments. And what that's showing in the work that's been done to date is that, as I said, the technical reports will support that these buildings aren't expected, apartments aren't expected to overheat.
Did you consider deck access?
We did look at a very early scheme, which had an element of it combined with buildings on corners that weren't deck access and then linked by certain sections. We found it to be quite a lot less efficient, to be honest, in terms of the amount of space it required on the floor to deliver the amount of housing. So we would have been looking at taller buildings to deliver the same quantity that we're looking at today.
Can I ask my wind tunnel question now? So when you presented the kind of technical version of the wind tunnel pictures at the Woodco board, members of the board said that they, perfectly healthy, not that elderly people, had been blown over in different parts of the estate, and that their experience did not fit with the technical evidence being given. Now, who knows, but I doubt that people are making up that they're being blown over. So what are we doing to make sure that there aren't wind tunnels, and how can we take into account the real lived experience of people saying, no, actually, I'm finding it really windy compared with whatever the technical wind measure says.
Yeah, I remember that point being made quite strongly. So we had further conversations with the wind consultant afterwards to understand what the difference is between the kind of graphical representations and lived experience. What the coloured plans show are basically a summary of a year where you've got wind coming from all different directions, and they highlight areas that are potentially problematic, but what they don't tell you is on a particular day, if the wind's coming from this direction, it can be problematic. Now, that's been supported by the work that's been done recently in the wind tunnel test, where they do the equivalent of a strong wind test, so particular strong gusts of wind, which have shown up issues around the base of the two existing towers. So perhaps more strongly represents in that more detailed study, as you say, the conversations we've had with residents. We're about to go through this again in more detail with Woodco in a couple of weeks with a person that knows much more about it than I do. But he is confident that the proposals for phase 4 have been designed in a way that gives us safe and appropriate wind conditions around the central square and the rest of the development, and that will be supported by reports that will be in the planning application.
Thanks, Chair. I want to come back to the Seven Sisters Road, and as part of the streetscape, I'm presuming you're laying the pavement. Is that correct? And so I should follow on first, just to say, as part of the original ambition that Councillor Desmond alluded to 15 years ago, the pavements were going to be widened to make a much more kind of attractive and useful streetscape. So have you incorporated that into the street this time?
So the boundary of the site goes up to the small wall that runs along phase 4. So our development will be inbound of that sort of boundary. Then beyond the small wall is the TfL pavement. And so you've got TfL pavement, 3 lanes of road, central reservation, 3 lanes of road, more pavement on the other side. So basically the scheme will be delivered on the TfL pavement. So the pavement area is TfL, has always been TfL, and it will remain as part of TfL.
Yeah.
Just to ask about the massing of the tower. I know some residents are quite concerned that originally it was 15 or 16 stories, then it went up to 21, and then it went up to 24. Can you talk through your justification of the increase? I don't think we'll be doing right by the residents if we don't ask that question tonight.
And also on the tower, can we just note in the report some sort of comments about the design of the tower and the impact on it. But also, when you look at the tower from the north looking south, it feels like that is a pretty blank sort of side of the tower, far less interesting than other sides of the tower, at least in the pictures. You just talk about the design of that as well.
To the first point about the tower's height, so yes, in the 2014, it was envisaged to be around 17 stories, but that was with a series of courtyard buildings, which in the work that we've done shown would have been, we've struggled in terms of daylight and sunlight in their central spaces. So as part of the development, we've looked at varying the height of the buildings and producing taller buildings. As the scheme has evolved, we started off actually with 2 mid-height buildings, and then through the design review process with the council, with the design review panel, we were encouraged to look at a more consistent height of building on Seven Sisters Road, so that all of those buildings are at 11 stories, whereas to start with, we actually had a taller one there. The height to deliver that meant that we actually had to increase the height of the tower slightly. I think coming back to the why is it that tall in the first place and how does it sit locally? It's that tall to deliver the quantity of housing that we need on the site while balancing all of those other factors of the local environment and daylight and sunlight that we've hopefully explained through the presentation. In terms of its position, because originally it was closer to Seven Sisters Road, it was on the corner at the top of the site rather than the corner at the base. As we've looked in both the local and the longer term views around how it's positioned to sit as in a cluster with the two existing taller buildings, which are taller than it, what you get with the position on that corner is a grouping rather than having buildings that have quite a separation between them and overall have a bigger visual impact when you're looking from Finsbury Park or from the reservoirs. And there will be, as part of the application to come forward, a full townscape assessment which shows that position and how it kind of combines as you move around both locally and in the further afield.
Councillor Joseph?
Thank you, Chair. Just on the height of that tower, I do appreciate the testing about wind, but as someone that lives on City Road, all these buildings have been tested and we've been told that there won't be wind tunnel, and the lived experience is it is very windy. So my question is actually for our officer. Sorry, I've forgotten your name, Catherine. Yes, sorry. Catherine, in terms of the height there, would there be a precedent set that would then enable further phases to increase the height?
I think the key point is that there are already 3 existing taller buildings, and it would contribute to that, and it would still be shorter than the tallest 2 of those buildings. So I think that precedent has already been established. The other thing to say is that it is quite tightly related to those existing buildings, so I don't think it would necessarily sort of allow for other phases necessarily, because they are quite remote from this particular building.
Young?
Sorry, I missed a question out before. I've got a last question that Woodco centres, which is on its sort of design. It is linked to tenure, but it's design. There is a real concern that the private rented properties are tending to be bought, often by foreign investors, and then let, and therefore they're not contributing to sort of building a community in any way, and they're actually being let out at prices which are just completely unaffordable for locals. The way that Woodco put this in their questions is, is there something in terms of the design that could be done to make these properties, to sort of tend these properties to a slightly more affordable level? Because what we're seeing is they're being bought and let out at a rate that nobody who lives in Hackney can afford. So what we're then seeing, if you knock on doors, is it's almost all overseas students living in those properties for very short periods of time. So they're not building that community that people had hoped in the area, and indeed is advertised in the sales pitch. So it's how do you design something that is just then a bit more affordable?
I think Jamie probably better answer on the sales side, but from a design perspective, I mean, a bit like them being tenure blind, we're designing good houses and good apartments. We're not designing them for a specific group of people. How do you make them as affordable as possible? Well, you actually make them as efficient as possible. So they're well designed on space standard. And so from a construction point of view, the price can be at its lowest. But I'll let you take the second point.
I suppose the other point, just in terms of Seven Sisters Road homes, the layouts of the shared ownership and the private are the same. They are interchangeable, and we've taken all of the layouts through the design committee that has members of Notting Hill Genesis on it, the council and Woodco, and everyone's commented on the layout. So they have all been seen and shared, and there's nothing peculiar about the private ones. They are just ordinary homes. So I'm slightly at a loss as to what I'm supposed to do to them to make them more attractive to homeowners. It's kind of an odd thing to.
So we need rent control, then that's the answer.
Okay, councillor Webb, and then we'll move on to outdoor spaces.
I did exactly what I'm not supposed to do. Noise of the microphone. I just wanted to ask about the relationship that we have with us and TfL. The point that Vincent Stocks has brought to our attention is that there has been this pot of money, so it's our pot of money towards road improvements, and you've confirmed it's TfL's road. And so it was just kind of the question of what would be the situation if TfL bring forward a road scheme that we disagree with and they go ahead. Can they go ahead if we disagree with them, or is it kind of like, you know, an agreement, or do we get the scheme here and we agree?
Christine's
Because
about to tell you
because Vincent's argument is if we don't like it, we shouldn't pay for it.
Yeah.
So if I just answer that, there is a working group. There will be a separate process about with proposals for what that looks like. Some of them have already come out, and it's just we've not been committed to yet. So I suppose it's Berkeley has paid the money as part of SIL or Section 106 or whatever it is. That sits in a pot. They're then as owners of the master plan, them plus presumably Hackney Council and TfL sit in a working group, and that will come either to us or somewhere else at a future date. You know, so there are concerns about overlooking from those people, but I suppose for this application, it's and the finer intricacies of that will come to us potentially at a future date, but don't sort of have aren't to do with this application.
I think
separate.
If I may, as part of that, I think there's going to be loads of stakeholder engagement anyway. So if they are going to improve, do that, they're going to engage Hackney Council and all the stakeholders that are involved, including Berkeley Homes. So
yeah,
there will be
including
extensive
residents,
opportunity to do that.
For the purposes of this application, though, we would presumably want to be sure that whatever design we have here is going to fit in with whatever happens, whatever TfL do with Seven Sisters Road. So we do.
No, so I suppose this
our
application
design
sits.
fits.
This application sits on what is currently Seven Sisters Road. So you, when this comes to a full application, the context of the environment is important, but not necessarily the future context, because the future, basically, they won't be able to build a road, a motorway, or a sort of helipad there because there are this master plan and this application is there. So this comes first.
Catherine, the case officer, can explain a bit more detail exactly with regards to what's happening with this and how it is linked with the other applications.
Certainly. So as members and the pre-applicants have said, the funding for the wider Seven Sisters Road improvement scheme, which is necessary to deliver the regeneration as a whole, is attached to the Phase 3 Section 106. The part of the Section 106 relating to that is very tightly controlled. It's very it's extensive, and there is a requirement for a steering group to be set up between Council, TfL, Berkeley Homes, and they have to reach agreement on what is to be delivered. I won't go into too much detail, but at the moment, as you'll be aware, there hasn't been much progress in reaching an agreement. So that is attached legally to Phase 3, and that work is ongoing in parallel to the other work going on the wider estate. This application will have to be looked at in the round, but on its own merit. The Seven Sisters Road Improvement Scheme is expected to be delivered, but we don't know the time frame for that. So in the interim, TfL's position, as I understand it, is that consideration has to be given to how this will link not only to the Seven Sisters Road Improvement Scheme, which shouldn't be an issue because the expectation is that there'll be road narrowing, urban greening, and the introduction of cycle lanes, the retention of bus lanes and the introduction of additional crossings, which can be engineered and designed to fit in with this. But that in the absence of that in the short and medium term, the desire lines that are going to be generated by this have to be addressed. That is something that's still a matter of discussion.
Okay. Can I just ask on in terms of the design and the buildings on St Cecilia's Road and the trees in particular? So the trees seem quite close to the buildings. They're obviously north of those north-facing buildings, so there's a sunlight issue for those. So do you have an arboreal, so the tree person, who will tell you whether these trees will sort of survive or will they thrive, being that close to the buildings and with sort of less sunlight than potentially a tree might like?
Yes, we have an arboricultural consultant on board who's advised pretty much on a tree by tree basis on what the likely requirements are of the trees to be retained and what we need to do in order to keep it away from the building and stop it from being problematic, but still allowing the tree to thrive. So yes, we have our guy on board.
Okay, thank you. I saw some hands up. What subjects are they on? Councillor Joseph?
Chair, well, I just wanted to follow up on Councillor Young's point about the design and the link to the house price, if I may. I mean, it's so basically, I take the point that you can't control, well, perhaps you can, house prices, but ultimately, so on the Berkeley website, there is information about how much the houses or the flats on Woodbury Down cost. And it shows that in between 2012 and 2018, the prices went up considerably, like 96%, which is more than the Hackney average of 42%. So I think there's something linked to what's being built and how much is being built and who it's being marketed to. Wouldn't you agree they're kind of marketed as luxury apartments?
So I don't really think this is I mean, at the end of the day, this isn't necessarily a planning material consideration for us. I think there's if you have specific questions about the design, that's fine. I mean, I would say that as a committee, what we don't do is encourage worse design. We try and get the highest quality design that we possibly can. House prices, this committee cannot develop a policy about what we think houses should be sold for. That's not within our remit. It's not within our power.
No.
They're called market sale homes for a reason. They are sold on the market. The social housing, as you well know, has a very specific sort of set of policies around about how much people pay, and then same with shared ownership. But I think Natalie, is that you already right? So I just don't think it's in our gift remit or locus really to be sort of questioning how much homes are sold for on the open market. I mean, it's a function of the market. The housing market is broken. I think we can all agree with that. But it is a function of the market, and within the viability of this, it all goes back into viability, isn't it? About market sale essentially delivering new social housing within this sort of envelope. So if you could either rephrase it or let that one lie, if you don't mind.
I mean, perhaps there are things that the private tenants' amenities that they've used in other phases that have made these house prices a bit higher than the rest of Hackney or made them increase faster. So perhaps that's just something that could be considered in the further phases in terms of affordability, because it is of note that they've increased particularly on Woodbury Down in comparison to the rest of Hackney. That's all, Chair.
Yeah,
thank you.
Desirability plays a big part in that, doesn't it, as well? Was there another hand up there, or if not, can we go on to outdoor space? So, outdoor space, the podium, maybe the parks, everything else. Questions, Councillor Young, Councillor Potter, or Councillor Potter? Go ahead. No.
So again, to your report, Catherine, in 5.13, there is some uncertainty over adoption responsibilities over the proposed public open spaces. I don't know if you were referring to the central square here, or which public spaces you're referring to?
It's primarily Central Square, the Pocket Park on the south of the site, and the St Olaf's Green Link Muse space. This is probably a question for my regen colleagues. There's a lot of discussion going on between these public spaces are intended to be adopted by the council in due course. There's a discussion going on whether that will be parks and open spaces or street scene. Who gets that responsibility in the long term affects how they're designed, because those two teams have different objectives, different criteria, different specifications. Sorry, 3 teams, I beg your pardon. And this is an ongoing discussion. I don't think we've reached a kind of resolution on how that's going to work out, but I think that's actually as much to do with the council's internal sort of arrangements going forwards as Berkeley Homes, as they have to respond to it, but they don't really exert the control over it, if that makes sense. I don't know if my colleagues in Regen want to come in.
Just to say that there are 2 elements of public open space proposed on this scheme. One is the Muse area and the other is the Central Square. We've had quite a lot of discussions with the 3 different departments or teams. There's street scene, there's parks, and there's also refuse people, waste management. Don't think they're part of street scene, Sandkirkens. But all 3 of them will be responsible for managing it. So I think who adopts it is sort of immaterial in some respects. It's about how those 3 organisations manage the properties or manage the space.
Sounds to me like that might need a resolution before it comes to application stage, though, I think. Yeah, Councillor, Joseph, then
Carry on,
Young,
sorry.
then Sam.
Can I carry on?
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing I was going to ask about was in terms of the podium access. I was wondering how accessible is it going to be by the general public, and how's that going to be managed? I know there's also a proposed library, isn't there, on the ground floor by the public square. Perhaps we should have covered this in the design stage. But obviously there is some alarm from Woodco and other residents about the possibility this could be used for commercial space. So I wonder how, it'd be good to have comments on that, which I know is slightly in the wrong place, I apologise, but also about what your plan is for managing the public access to the podium and how that is going to work.
The podium is intended for the residents and their visitors only, so it's not for public access.
I could build on that a little bit. So the basis of the design that you've seen today is that it's a tenure blind garden for the residents that live around it. There have been discussions about the library, as you've mentioned, and the potential to provide some of that, and it's a portion of it that would be secondary to a library space or an alternative civic use. That's part of the library study that's being done by the council at the moment, and perhaps Jane, pick it up from there.
Thanks, Martin. Yes, so the council is undertaking a library feasibility study at the moment. So that's a piece of work that's led by our library services colleagues, but the regeneration team are also supporting. And that's really looking at the context and the need for a library, some opportunities around co-location, and a library potentially becoming a kind of library plus type of hub. But also looking at the space that would be required within what's currently denoted as the flexible space within phase 4, facing onto the central square. And I think part of that is also about looking at the opportunities for getting some access to the podium garden. So it wouldn't be the entire podium garden area, but it would be a portion of that. And that also comes back to finance issues. So for example, if it was accessible, if the library could access the entire area, then that would have a knock-on charge to the library service as well. So there are multiple sort of considerations there that are going on, but the library feasibility study is currently being undertaken, and we anticipate having a report towards the end of the year on that.
Okay. Can I just ask a question about the podium as well whilst we're on it? So the podium essentially is there because the car park is underneath and it needs ventilation, right? And then we use that space for quite a large amount of the play space and the sort of outdoor space for residents. I mean, is that best practice? Is the car exhaust fumes and the pollution is coming up from there? That's what it's sort of for a bit, I suppose. Is this the best place to put that outdoor space, the play space for kids in particular?
There's actually very little, because of the ventilation design, there's actually very little coming up into the podium. It's really minimal. You struggle to find it. In fact, I'm not going to talk specifically about ventilation because that's outside of my outside of remit, but perhaps Martin can expand on the ventilation methodology.
So yeah, it is kind of mechanically assisted ventilation. So we have looked at various stages through the progress about doing a distributed and naturally vented approach, which would have a more frequent openings on the podium. As it is, there is one location where you have an air intake that is coming through a combination of the car park entrance and actually the cycle stores that because they have louvered screens on it, you can draw air through them. And then it is exhausted on one point on the podium, which is located within a vegetative border, so there's not play space directly adjacent to it.
If it's mechanically ventilated, where does the ventilation end up?
So it does come up. The exhaust route is onto the podium, but only in one location.
So the ventilation does still empty out onto the podium, right? So if we had a pollution monitor on the podium without the ventilating shaft versus with it, you would see a difference, presumably.
So these are factored in when we're doing the air quality assessments. So the proximity to facades and people's opening windows and such like. So that will be considered in perhaps the technical report. Again, we don't believe there to be an issue.
Okay, but if there was an issue, if you're mechanically ventilating it, why could you not sort of send it upwards somewhere else out of the?
A quantity of air. It's a hole that is several square meters, and you'd have to channel that through the building, which would add another shaft rising through that you'd have to design.
If it's mechanically ventilated, does that mean it's noisy?
No, actually, we did some as part of the service charge work when we were looking at the overall resultant service charge from having the podium, which is something we've been through with the Woodco and the design group. I think we worked out that it was something like the fans were running for several minutes a day. They're impulse fans. They come on if there is a car idling in the space, and then there's a detector, and it will ventilate to stop there being a build-up. But I think it was something like 50 pounds of electricity a year to pay for the fans. So they're really on very infrequently.
Questions on that or anything else on the podium?
Podium generally, yeah. Okay, can we go right back to the beginning on the podium? So for those of us who don't spend our entire lives hearing about this podium, can you explain why there is a podium? Why do we have to have a podium at all? Why can't we just have green space on the ground in the usual way?
So largely it is driven by the requirement for providing car parking on the plot, which is one of the underlying parts of the PDA for Woodbury Down and protection of existing residents' rights. We have looked through the design process at alternatives, including providing it on street, which would be contrary to other Hackney policies about street design and enhancement of street locations. In the round, the only way to avoid it is then to go to designs, which in this particular instances are very expensive and not viable for the wider development.
So a commitment was made, as you said earlier, as it says in the reports, that because this is something that's being done to the community, that people's parking spaces, their rights to parking spaces, if they currently have a parking permit, would be retained. And this is for the question for the Regen team. questions have been raised because time's moved on. We have different views about whether that could have been revisited, because we seem to be doing quite a lot in order to retain those parking spaces. And also over time, those parking spaces won't be needed because we won't be replacing permits. That's right, isn't it? So if somebody moves off the estate or dies or ceases to have a car, that space will go. Is it absolutely essential that we have this podium just in order to protect these parking spaces, or is that something that could be reconsidered?
I think where we've got to on phase 4 is that we've got that very strong commitment that the council has made to existing tenants, and you know it is, yeah, as I say, it is a strong commitment that the council has made from the beginning of the regeneration at Woodbury Down, and it's part of keeping communities together. I think actually it's part of, you know, ensuring that people do make that choice to stay on the estate. I take the point, it does seem like quite a lot of car parking. I think if you were looking at another development that wasn't an estate regeneration, that's not what you'd see in Hackney and in other boroughs. I think it may be something that's worth having a look at as part of the future phases if there is an appetite to actually reduce the amount of car parking going forward, which it sounds as if certainly hearing from Woodco members today, there is some a change in the general sense around that. So
Can I ask a follow up on the car parking?
Yeah.
Is the car parking space attached to the person or the social housing unit? At what point does that car park space sort of fall into abeyance if it's attached to the person? Is it when they personally are no longer around, or is it when they no longer have a car? What's the process around that? And then I suppose the point being that at some point, I hope, you know, because I hope the answer to the first question is not a car parking space attached to the unit. These car parking spaces won't be needed anymore. So what's the point of the space? What's the future plan for the space there?
So just oh crikey. So just in terms of Woodbury Down and the tradition of people living on the estate, we've got people that have lived on the estate since they were very young. There's lots of people that have lived on the estate for more than 50 years. So yes, there is a requirement to provide the car parking spaces, and us as the applicant will respond to the number we're asked to provide. There will be a process of those spaces becoming surplus to requirement over time, but that timescale could be 6 months, could be 30 years, and this is where it gets slightly difficult to quantify. The intention is to allocate the person with the car, the existing resident that has a current parking space on the estate with the ability to park their car on phase 4. As and when that's no longer required, those spaces can come back, and we could look to maybe change those to additional accessible spaces, because we also have within the car park there are 3% accessible spaces. The GLA requirement, and I think the council
Sorry, what do
requirement
you mean by
is
accessible spaces?
wheelchair disabled spaces. So not only are the spaces for existing social rented tenants with a car parking space, there is also the sort of general requirement for accessible spaces. So we have, I think there's 53 social rented spaces and 11 accessible spaces, which is 3%, but the GLA policy would expect anywhere between 3 and 10%. So we are providing the bare minimum of accessible spaces so they can be swapped to those for sort of lifetime homes and move on, or alternatively we could look to increase car parking space, cycle spaces if required.
Sorry, increase
cycle spaces if required. So we can do a needs assessment as they go on, and if there's a push and a desire for more spaces, those certain portions of the car park could be looked at to swap.
And if we
Councillor Young,
didn't
Councillor
have the,
Webb after that.
can I carry on with this about this? Are there any other reasons to have the podium other than the car?
I think in the work that we've done, because we have for discussion with the design committee looked at a diagrammatic scheme which didn't have the parking. There are, going back to the kind of activation of the facades, there are other benefits that the podium brings. It's not just the parking, it is concealing, it's all the plant space, it's all the bikes and the bin storage that you then won't see from a street frontage point of view. Now, if you manage to recover that car parking area and sink that kind of bit of podium to ground, in the schemes, and I emphasize this was diagrammatic, but all of those things are then facing onto you. So rather than having public space, communal space that is overlooked by housing and fronted by people's terraces and their usable space, you have inactive facades around it, which from a safety point of view, from a good design point of view, is not desirable. So there is a quality aspect there. And the one thing, so the podium does allow us to provide the parking space, but it also means that in terms of some of the things that Mark talked about, play space, biodiversity, urban greening, by the fact that we're layering two things on top of each other, means that we're able to hit all those other targets in terms of planning policy and delivering of green space.
Couldn't you have the same amount of green space on the ground level? You didn't have the car park.
It's because it's not all parking. There are those other, the cycle stores and the bin stores. It's also those elements that are incumbent within the podium.
Can I ask about the privacy of it? I will stop in a second. So one of the other issues about the podium is the fact that it's private space, not accessible by other members of the community. So it's restricted to people who, to tenants and other residents. Is there any option? This is probably for you. Is there any option for the whole of the podium being accessible to the public, so that it's all very well having this green space, but if members of the public can't use that green space, how helpful is it?
I think one of the positives that's worth noting about this podium on phase 4 is that I think I'm right in saying that this is the first podium that's been, or the first sort of internal courtyard podium garden that's been accessible to all tenures. So previously, on previous phases at Woodbury Down, there has been more of a, a separation between the tenures with that open space. I think the challenge that we have with opening up the podium garden, and I realise this might not be just a question for Hackney, it might be a sort of wider question as well. I think there are issues around the desirability from those tenants who actually have, or residents who have access to that, whether they want that to be a public space. You might think twice about letting your kids play out there if it, without you being there necessarily, if it was a more public space. And I think a key thing really is around the fact that that would put quite a significant financial burden on the council, because that space would have to be adopted. And it was never anticipated to be one of those spaces that would be adopted, because the service charge will effectively pay for the management and maintenance of that podium garden. So that will be an additional burden on the council's finances. Previously, we anticipated using ground rent to pay for that, and that's obviously no longer an option going forward. I don't know if do you want to add anything?
I was only going to add really that the podium garden is a private garden for residents of those blocks, and this is not unique on Woodbury Down. We've got podium gardens for every other phase, and I think it's just the fact that it's such a large space, because it is multi-tenure, that it's bringing to the forefront that it's something that's not fair. It should be public, but actually it's only providing, in fact, it's providing less space per person than the one on phase 2.
Yeah, no, when we looked at the equivalency with phase 2, it's about per dwelling, it's about the same quantity of space. It's just that you've got more apartments that are sharing that space.
And I guess it's worth saying that we are sort of trying to strike a kind of compromise or balance by looking at having some of that space accessible through the library. I mean, I think it's great that so many people want access to that space, because I think it sort of it shows what a good sort of desirable designer is in a way.
Okay.
Just on that question,
Quickly.
is it something that this committee could impose a condition that that's part of that space be accessible, and that
You
if it
can ask
wasn't
for
a library,
conditions
there'd
when
be
it comes to
something
application.
else?
You can ask for conditions when it comes to application.
I won't be
Not
here.
now. I definitely had Councillor Potter. I've got Councillor Joseph, Councillor Sadek, Councillor Potter first.
I don't want to take too much time on the parking, so I know we've still got other stuff to get through, but I just wanted to clarify, if you could say very briefly, how have you managed the parking side of things in the previous phases, very simply? And is this just accessible to the tenants within phase 4, or is it accessible to, a wider group of tenants on the estate?
No,
And the other question I was going just to ask, is it much more expensive to maintain a podium garden? I was just wondering, just as an interest, because obviously that's also a consideration.
I'll take a bit of that. The parking is for the residents of phase 4 only. It's secured at the entrance from the street, so those with permits would have fob control to get in, but it would only be for them. In terms of the cost, that's something that we've looked at quite carefully as part of the design committee's work, and there has been an estimation done of what the likely service charges are going to be, and they are commensurate with the other phases at Woodbury Down. We don't expect any increase. What the benefit here is that the podium is being shared by a large number of units, a large number of dwellings, and therefore, as an overall, that's bringing the service charge, as I say, in line with the other phases at Woodbury Down.
Sorry. I mean, in terms of, the forward thinking and use, so I accept, why it's really important for existing residents to have a parking space. It is going to be a problem, but it isn't just going to be a problem for phase 4, it's going to be a problem in your other phases and other developments in Hackney. So obviously it doesn't impact really this application, but some thought needs to go in to how we manage those spaces, because they could become really kind of problematic in years to come, but that's not really for you to comment. I think that's
only to say that in the context of the master plan, given that, as was being explained earlier, a lot of the residents, by the time we've completed phase 4, will have been relocated. As we move on to phases 5, 6, 7, this should be a much reduced issue. We shouldn't be looking at the same quantity of parking.
Great, thanks. I have Councillor Joseph next, then councillors.
Thank you, Chair. I know we've touched on the library already, which sounds great, and that's mentioned in 3.3 of the officer's report as an aspiration. And it says if the civic hub is not feasible, the space is expected to be made available for commercial uses. I just think it's very important that there is indoor community space. It's such a big development, and there'll be such an increase in density. So if that library didn't go ahead, would there be any community meeting rooms in any of these buildings? For example, if the residents wanted to start a TRA for that kind of area.
We've got quite a lot of community space already on Woodbury Down. We have Block D that the council have been working to find tenants for, which is a 11,000 square feet community space. We've already got a community centre on the estate, and there is a community room coming forward on phase 3. In terms of the floor space on phase 4, there's I think it's something like 1,200 square metres around of floor space. That's a lot of floor space. So the thought is a proportion of that could come forward as a library, and there will be, it's basically a big flexible space. So as and when, if the council tell me that they do want a library, and then they tell me how big a space they want, there will still be some additional space that will be used for commercial. So it will go in as part of the planning application as a flexible space, and it will be chopped up accordingly. We have made a commitment to, if the library space isn't something that is feasible, that we would look to see if there's other things that could come forward in its place, because I'm very aware that phase 4 is the sort of civic heart of Woodbury Down, and that was the intention when I sort of asked the council, do you have something that could anchor this space? And it was a sort of drive on our part to look for something that could provide that sort of civic heart. So library is one of the most obvious things, but if there are other things in your locker, happy to listen to what they might be.
Do people want a break, or do you want to carry on?
Let's carry on.
Oh, God. Carry on?
How much have we got? How much we got to go?
Well, a bit of sustainability. I think if we don't go over things too much, and sort of once you get if someone else asks a question, you get an answer to it. Don't feel the need to repeat the question. Then let's crack on. But if we get to 9:30, we don't look like we're finishing it. Well, okay. Councillor Sadek, and then Councillor.
Thanks, Chair. I had 3 questions. Councillor Joseph has already asked one of them. The second one is possibly teetering on the edge of something I'm going to be slapped down for, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it's very important for this phase, given that, as you just said, this is the civic heart of Woodbury Down. Something that is really important, and I'm sure this is captured in the various plans that we work to, is the sort of a development like this, bringing people from different backgrounds together, and there being a certain level of integration or mixing of people from the different tenures and from the wider community. I'm just wondering about this central square. I suppose it's 2 questions, one for council officers and one for the designers, for the architects. For the council, with the other sort of big, large bits of public realm from the previous phases, has that been a success story within this sense in terms of people from across the estate and beyond coming and mixing together from different backgrounds? And then for the architects and designers, has that been a consideration that's featured in your plans for the central square, and if so, how?
Me again, sorry. So the existing large space at Woodbury Down is Spring Park. That is extremely successful. Come rain or shine, there's people there all the time. We've just had the Hidden River Festival back in September, which again was another hugely popular event, which saw people from across the estate come and use it. So I'm confident that what we've got works well, and I'm confident that the Civic Square at Central Square will also do the same.
Last question. It was just on play space, and I guess looking at the maps, it looks like that, if I understood the pictures, the diagrams correctly, that most of the play space is concentrated in the inside bit, the podium, rather than, yeah. I just wondered, within that, does that play space or those facilities cover a range of ages, or is it primarily for younger kids? Because it's, I think something that would be desirable would be play space or facilities, whatever they might be, for older young people as well, youth. Has that been achieved?
There's a mixture of age groups, both at ground floor and on the podium, but we've focused our attention on ages 0 to 11. The older group is going to be dealt with beyond the site, but that isn't to say that there aren't attractions to older groups to encourage them to come together. So if you're between 11 and 17, there's nothing to suggest that you wouldn't be participating in normal community activity anyway, enjoying facilities or the events that might be taking place in the space that we provided. But in terms of kind of boisterous ball sports or kind of athletic activities, we haven't put anything into this site for that, just because it's kind of like spatially difficult and probably slightly inappropriate given the density of the populations living and overlooking these spaces.
But that is part of the wider master plan approach. So when the 2014 was set, this site, there were other locations around the estate that were designated for teenage play. So the sports pitch down by the West Reservoir, and the Muga on the north side, and the developing master plan would also take that into account. But phase 4 was never seen as the right location to deliver that type of youth play. It would happen elsewhere.
Okay, Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. For the car park, is there a car club space? And second part is I am increasingly stepping over Lime bikes. I know it's the power of suggestion, but perhaps there could be a place where people could leave their Lime bikes if they bring them into the car park, and then they could have a nook for them for those kind of
Sorry,
electronic
I don't understand what you're saying.
Lime bikes, Lime scooters, which get dropped on the pavement all over the place. Could there be given a nook that in the car park they could be encouraged to put them into one space, and the car club? That was the.
I think Hackney generally has the thing around Lime bikes. I suppose they probably don't want them in private spaces where no one can access
But
them.
maybe it's a good place, and maybe they might want to leave them. They will be left there, Chair. I'm just saying if you got to think of these
Co-car
things.
clubs and co-bike clubs.
Right. So I think there's probably issue with security, and if you have access to the car park for people that are members of the public, so there's the secure by design aspect.
Not a public thing. I'm just saying people, that live there.
Yeah, but there's tons of also visitor cycle parking all over the master plan of the phase 4, so you can have lots of opportunities to park your bike, and there's also larger spaces, so you can park any kind. So in terms of car club, it's not something that is supported by TfL. So it's not being provided on phase 4, but there are spaces nearby that people could use. Yes, but it's not something specifically being provided as part of phase 4. And we're also trying to maximize. We're trying to minimize any car parking along Woodbury Down. So we're trying to give most of that space to public realm parking, cycle parking, and things like that. So we're trying to avoid having additional spaces. It's generally not something TfL is supporting anymore in terms of provision, because they're trying to minimize any kind of car usage, but there are spaces nearby.
Microphone, please.
Microphone,
please. And what's the question? And Councillor Webb, into your microphone, and then ask a question, please.
The other thought was in regards to the use of the library. How's the provision for healthcare facilities? Just because in Hackney Wick, we have all these residents and they haven't got a GP to go to.
In terms of the application spaces provided, is something, I mean, what fills it is up to, yeah, go ahead.
No, a question about whether we've considered health within that. So as part of the library's ability study, they will be looking at all sorts of different options around co-location. So I think absolutely that's worth looking at. But the rest of the applicant team might want to say something about provision of health, because I think we have got some information on that.
Yep. So we will do a socio-economic assessment, which includes a health assessment in terms of are there enough doctor surgeries or doctors for the population. So yes, that will come in as an assessment.
Okay, yes.
Please. Can I just ask about lessons learned from other phases?
On what?
On this central square.
On the central square?
Yeah.
Yes, although I feel like Councillor Sadek did sort of cover that a little bit, but lessons learned, fine.
So I just wanted to ask about so Spring Park is very successful, as you said. What are we taking from that? So yes, Spring Park's successful. it's not really clear to me, looking at the plans for this central square, what's being learned from Spring Park and applied there. Similarly, in other areas that we're talking about, the podium garden, what lessons are we learning from the use of other private gardens here? So do we actually know that people will use a private garden rather than a public space? So we do know in Woodbury Down, people use the public spaces really, really well. And as far as I'm aware, people don't use the private spaces very well. So how are we learning lessons on those?
So, sorry, you'll be bored to death of me later. So in terms of Central Square, it has a different function to Spring Park. Spring Park's more open, it's there for play, and Central Square is more for civic function and gathering, and so that's why the space has been designed in a flexible way so that you could have, and we will have it in 2 weeks' time, which is the Winterfest, which is the Christmas tree and the lights. So it's more of that kind of use. So there will be a bit more hard standing, so there could be the flexibility of maybe a market every now and again, but it has a different function to Spring Park. Things like benches, so we understand that there's a sort of a big drive to understand how benches are used. Kids want to use them in a different way, elderly people need arms and things like that, so that's been taken on board by Mark and his team. But we will also go out and do some workshops with young people, older people, to narrow down that design of the benches and where they position them. So yes, there's an element of design fixed in terms of the Central Square, but there is opportunity through, when the conditions would ultimately come through, to continue working with the community to refine that detail so it reflects a space that everyone can use.
Sorry, to Councillor Young, microphone and a question.
On the private garden, what lessons have been learned from the existing use or lack of use of private gardens for this, another private garden on the podium?
The facilities here, I think, differ quite extensively from some of the other delivered private gardens, where they've been quite passive. Simple arrangements of seating and planting, and they haven't managed to compete with the facilities that sit outside. The amazing offer that is the new river and the reservoirs and all that frontage, and indeed Spring Park that builds onto that. I think this is a very different proposition with play that's fundamental to every parent's life. So I think, I think it's just very different to previous delivered places.
I think it's also.
I think the other thing about a podium garden is its kind of amenity value. It's looking out on a garden. It's not looking out on a car park or not looking out on a piece of green grass. It's actually, enhances the internal environment of those flats that all look around.
And just say one thing on the character of those spaces, where we did have quite a few comments early on from the design committee, from residents, about them being kind of, in terms of the planting approach, quite sterile spaces, quite manicured. And the design proposal that is coming forth from Mark is very, very different to that. It's wilder. It's more to do with the successful environment around the, I'm going to get my size right, East Reservoir, where you've got that kind of wild quality that we are looking to build upon as part of the fundamental identity of Woodbury Down as a place.
Councillor Foster wants to ask one more question about this.
Sorry, something that occurred to me before. When I was looking at the design, and this might be my perception, which is wrong, the question I'm going to pose is, when does a bit of open space become classified as a, I've forgotten the term already, it's gone out of my head, a public square? Because it doesn't seem to me to be big enough to perform that function, and it might just be my perception, so please correct me, but I mean, can you just describe how you're making the place a public square, and whether you think it is sufficient size? Be very quick, 1 or 2 sentences. I'm sure the chair will be quite happy with that.
We worked quite hard at that like a qualitative analysis of what makes up a public space. And I think that led to one of the initial moves was potentially public space is one of the factors of it is the edges. And so that fed into the rotation of the square to strengthen up its edges and increase the amount of activity that sits around the edges. You know, so part of that is about trying to create a successful relationship between the fill, the space, and its edges. And we've tried to do that by creating as much open space as we can within the limits of working around the existing trees. Around each of those existing trees, there's a large amount of root protection area that we need to respect. And we try to do that with a philosophy of planting, which, going back to what I said at the beginning of my presentation, was bringing some of that character in from the site edges, from the reservoirs. And so we've tried to balance hard and soft landscape as much as possible. I think it's, at the moment, I think it's about half and half. It's quite a big area. It's just under half the size of a full-size football pitch. So it's quite, you know, it is quite a sizable space. And we've just basically made every effort to invite people in. We've adapted early designs, had a very protective edge to the road that was seen as quite a boundary, marking quite a strong boundary, and wasn't in the spirit of connected spaces, and we've now opened that up and connected facades back to the streets. So we have worked quite hard to make it an inviting place and a place that slows people down, which is ultimately what we want to do.
Thank you. Can I just take hands? Does anyone want a break? Put your hand up if you do. And then if you do, it's not a vote, as in if over half of you do, then we'll go. If any one person wants a break, then we can just break 5 minutes. If nobody wants a break, we'll just crack on. Great, okay, fine. Can we move on to sustainability, please, as the sort of final big topic that I had down? I'm going to lead off on this. So the claims for the site are that it's 100%, that it's completely net zero. I'm not sure how that's delivered just simply through sort of source heat pumps and things like that. Demolition construction is quite carbon intensive. So can you just set out your thinking behind how it is so environmentally sound? That'd be great, thank you.
So my colleague Matthew is going to respond on this one. Yeah, so in terms of the net zero carbon status of the scheme, that's based on the operational emissions associated with this phase. But obviously, as we've alluded to before, it's also helping in the decarbonisation of the wider master plan. So working through the energy hierarchy, there's obviously a massive focus on reducing the overall demand of this building, not least to reduce carbon, but also to reduce the running costs for residents. Our initial modelling is showing that we're achieving about a 20% reduction in energy demands through the fabric of the building, through the ventilation, etc., before the application of any other measures. On the heat network, the introduction of heat pumps is really, really crucial to the strategy. So the CO2 emissions that we've calculated and estimated for this phase are based on carbon intensities on the national grid today. But looking forward into the future, all government predictions are that electricity will be decarbonising. So by 2035, we expect it to be almost zero carbon, which basically puts this phase on a trajectory to be almost zero carbon by 2035 without any other measures. Then beyond that, we're also planning to install solar PV on the roof, which will generate electricity to be used on site. Again, there's benefits associated with that, both related to carbon dioxide emissions and also running costs. And beyond that, there's also going to be various other measures which will help people manage their energy use. So the controls of the heating system, the way that they're metered and billed, things like that all help to reduce the energy use on site. In terms of what you alluded to in relation to energy in the materials and CO2 in the materials, That's been a very large focus in the design. So that's essentially involved looking at the use of materials, both in the construction of the new buildings, but also in the demolition of the existing ones. So we followed a hierarchy and are expecting to significantly exceed the GLA targets in terms of embodied carbon and embodied energy on the site. That's in the approach to that includes the reuse of materials. So we're planning on diverting construction waste and demolition waste. 95% of it will be diverted from landfill. That primarily will be used on site wherever possible, but if it can't be used on site, it will be taken off site for either reuse or recycling. And then in terms of the design of the new building, the design's focused on conserving materials and conserving carbon. So that's both through the minimization of the use of materials, so efficient design, things like designing out transfer slabs wherever possible, efficient substructure design, etc. Also responsible sourcing of the materials that we'll be using. So in terms of the concrete that's used on site, we'd be looking to use a high proportion of recycled aggregates, as well as cement replacement materials to reduce the CO2 associated with that. And then also the use of recycled contents. So there's a target to meet at least 20% of each building, of the total building elements will include recycled materials. So it's very much embedded in the scheme design from start to finish.
Great, thank you. And in terms of the materials as well, we know that it is bricks being used, isn't it? It's not brick slips or anything, so it's bricks. We've discussed previously with other applicants the use of mortar, that there's a certain term and a certain type of mortar that can be used that makes reuse of bricks in the future much more easy than the classic traditional mortar. Obviously, quite a lot of the embedded carbon is in the firing of the bricks, and any sort of redevelopment a long way in the future, if you can reuse those bricks, that's more helpful. So does your sort of carbon intensive sort of strategy go down to the use of mortar and things like that, and what you might use?
Yeah, very much so. So the circular economy strategy for the sites, which sits alongside the embodied carbon strategy, looks at everything like that. So basically for every building element, there's a strategy to maximize the potential to reuse it. So using those kind of innovative mortar mixes is part of that exercise.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Foster, Councillor Sadek.
I was just going to ask first of all to Catherine, and I'll ask all my questions together anyway. So in 5.18, it mentions on page 18, it's unclear from the information provided to date how the proposals take a fabric first approach, which minimises the carbon footprint of the development over its lifetime. I presume the fabric first thing was an error, because fabric first refers more to retrofit, doesn't it? I presume that meant embodied carbon. Well, fabric, you would expect modern buildings to be built to high thermal efficiency. Fabric first comes in before you start designing a heating system with all the buildings, doesn't it?
Fabric first refers to the whole design concept as well. It's not just the physical materials that a building will be constructed of. It's also things like the orientation, the glazing ratio to solid, which will affect the degree of solar gain and overheating, whether it's mechanically or passively ventilated and has cross ventilation built in. So I might need to bring in my colleague Louise, who is our climate change officer, because it is a very technical area of the consideration. But as I understand it, fabric first applies to new build and to retrofit.
I'll accept that. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I didn't know that. So, do you think the answers that you're getting now are answering, or would you need to go to your colleague?
It might be of use to have Louise available to answer precise technical questions. As with much of the information that's been provided to date, and it is a very movable feast, things come in, things go out, and things have evolved since this report was written for the original date. But essentially, there are some big claims being made in terms of sustainability. I don't think we're really seeing the detail of how that's going to be achieved and delivered. I think we certainly, this detail will be forthcoming within the planning application, but we're not, there's no convincing evidence is the wrong word, but evidence, for want of a better word, to suggest that the objectives that are being set out in the documentation can be achieved at the current time.
Thanks, Stefan. Can I just follow on to the?
Yep.
Can you further reassure us based on, what we've heard back from Catherine, that could you just say what the air source heat pumps are going to look like? Are they going to sit on buildings? Are they going to be hidden? About visibility, about noise?
Sure.
Is it for each flat? Is the air source peak
No,
for each
that's-
flat?
yeah,
Is it a
I'll answer
common-
that. So firstly, the detail is forthcoming. There have been a lot of technical reports that have been undertaken in the past month, and that the application will be fully supported by information for ultimately you to make your judgment on. In terms of the position of the heat pumps, they are large pieces of kit that ultimately they don't serve the individual apartments directly. They sit on the top of two buildings, on the tallest building on Block C and on building A4, which is the one on the north side of Central Square. They link through back to the energy centre, which serves the whole estate, and then they kind of come back in a loop to serve the individual residents. They have a heat interface unit within each apartment, which is modern equivalent of the boiler. That's how they get their heat out of it. I could bring the visuals back up, but within the visuals there is two approaches to plant screening. So you will not see them from street. On the top of the taller tower, the tower is extended, so there's a brick enclosure at the top of that building, which is a story height enclosure, into which the air source heat pumps are placed. On the lower building, it's a screen, as a metal screen that sits on top of the building. Acoustically, we do have to be very careful about them. They do generate a quantity of noise. Putting them on the tops of buildings actually helps because you're reducing the amount of people that are then affected by them, because you've got less, the noise is going up because of the screening, and you've got less people in proximity. And those acoustic tests are being undertaken as part of the technical review to show that no neighbouring properties or properties within the development would be impacted by the noise generated.
So just to summarise there, it's the air source heat pumps are feeding into the central system. Then back.
Correct. Yep.
Right.
Okay, can you turn that off, please?
Thank you.
Councillor Sirk.
Mine was just a quick clarification question about the point that was made on recycled materials being used in the building works. I think you said 20% of the overall building materials will include recycled material. I just wondered if that was a deliberate choice of use of the word include, or whether you meant will comprise, 20% of it will comprise recycled materials.
That was a deliberate use of the term. It's following GLA policy, but that's very much a minimum target, not a maximum target. So.
Okay, Councillor Young, Councillor Joseph after.
On the air source heat pumps, just back to this, what lessons have we learned from previous phases? Obviously, we haven't had air source heat pumps with a communal heating system for buildings this size, as I understand it, on previous phases. So this is new to us. But we have had significant heating problems in previous phases. So what have we learned from that? And also, what are we learning from elsewhere where air source heat pumps have been used for communal heating systems for such big buildings? And do we know they work?
Yes, yeah. So we've done quite a lot of research into both the theory of using air source heat pumps on large developments, but also the experience elsewhere. And I think it's safe to say there isn't a lot of experience elsewhere in this country. So as with all district heating, we've turned to Denmark. And the key lessons that we've learned from there is that they need to be flexible. You need to have quite a lot of choice about when you run them. So the use of thermal storage, which is located in phase 3, is really crucial. So if the price of electricity instantaneously is very high to purchase, then you'll be able to switch them off and rely on thermal storage. And when the price drops, probably overnight or at certain times of the day, then you can switch them back on and operate them that way. In terms of lessons from elsewhere at Woodbury, but also on other district heating networks, probably the key takeaway message is to reduce the temperatures of operation within the buildings. So that both helps the efficiency of the network and reduces running costs, but obviously has a major impact on thermal comfort levels within the building as well. So reducing those temperatures and adding more insulation to the pipework is key to the strategy.
Just in terms of the cost of running people's energy in their homes, if the air source heat pump is not heating your home sufficiently, do you have a kind of what else do you have? Do you have an immersion heater or something that you switch on as well? And is that super expensive?
No, there is no backup within the dwelling. You could have plug-in heaters, but we don't think they're necessary. So the alternative is if the heat pumps can't run for any reason, and they won't be able to always run due to maintenance, there's resilience in gas boilers, which are located in phase 3 as well.
So Joseph?
Thank you, Chair. See, quite a number of the existing buildings are quite young, and obviously in terms of embodied carbon, probably the worst thing you can do is demolish and rebuild. So I just wondered if at any stage you had considered integrating any of the existing buildings into your design, refurbishing and perhaps extending them rather than knocking them down completely.
Yep, we did look at that, and it's obviously one of the key issues of policy HA to the London plan is whether you refurbish or redevelop. So it's a very key aspect of it. We've looked, I mean, they're not that young, actually. They're quite some of the earlier buildings of Woodbury Down. I think they're 1950s buildings. They are all of an age. We've obviously looked at the existing building plans. We've had an existing building survey undertaken. We've also had an accessibility survey taken. Whilst the buildings are of a good, reasonably good condition, they're not really structurally able to be extended. They are at the extent of their height. In terms of looking at whether you could infill within any of the blocks, as you've probably seen from the parallel nature of the blocks and the spaces between, there's not really any spaces you can extend or build in between. So effectively, you've got the 200 units you've got at the moment. The existing building survey and the accessibility survey have identified some key issues with the existing buildings, particularly in terms of accessibility. There is not particularly great step-free access to many of the buildings. There is only one lift in each of the buildings, and those are quite small lifts. Obviously, with newer blocks, you look at having 2 lifts, because if one lift fails, then you've got a backup lift. So you don't have the opportunity to introduce that. A lot of the balconies, we've talked about the deck access, a lot of the balconies are actually quite narrow. They don't actually meet accessibility standards. You really shouldn't be able to get a wheelchair or sometimes even a pram down some of those balconies. And in terms of trying to rectify all of those issues, actually, it creates a massive problem. And it really is, there is only really one solution, which is to redevelop and then therefore re-provide new homes on the site.
Thanks very much. I don't get any hands up for anything on sustainability. Is there anything anyone wants to ask that's not been covered so far? I definitely won't let you relitigate anything that we've been over already. Final chances? No? You can have one question. Go ahead.
Okay, bins. The podium, I think, means that the bins can be on the ground floor. Is that right? Okay. Can you just talk a little bit about why that's good and the benefits of that over and above the bins, sort of underground bins, which you would have if there weren't podiums? I understand from some of the earlier phases that some of the bin store areas on the ground floor are pretty awful and not brilliantly designed. They're smelly. People don't use them properly because they're difficult to access. So how will these bin stores be designed to be well used, clean, and not unpleasant?
Yes, we have had feedback on a number of lessons learned on the bin stores, and some of them are quite basic elements about the specification of the doors, making sure there's adequate ventilation, washdown facilities, the type of walls that are surrounding the bin store, to make sure that they can be maintained easily over time. That's not something that's necessarily embedded in the planning application, but the commitments have been made to review this alongside the design committee, and it will be part of the development of those details post-planning. In terms of their position, it goes back to conversations around service charge and the different tenures. And it was actually one of the fundamental things to do with putting the two social rented buildings on Woodbury Down, because we can have bin stores there that are accessed straight off street, so collected by the refuse collectors without any need for management movement of the bins. Now, the nature of the site does dictate that, because we can't get access from Seven Sisters Road for collections, and we have asked TfL whether or not it's possible, but they have flat refused. And Woodbury Down is also not an appropriate location for getting close enough to the building to collect the bins. So there is allowance for 3 collection points that sits on Woodbury Down. There is the bins would have to be managed so on collection day for the blocks, particularly on Seven Sisters Road, residents will deposit their refuse, and then the building management will take those bins to the bin presentation area, I think it's called, which is off street. Yes, lovely term. Which is off street and concealed away from the frontage, but does allow the bins to collect them within required distances.
It was a nice velvet curtain at the bin presentation. Councillor Potter.
Hi, thanks. I don't think this has been raised, so apologies if it has. I know there was some concern raised by Woodco with us about the access for deliveries, etc. So I just wondered whether you wanted to comment on the strategy around that and how that's going to be workable for residents, delivery drivers.
So aligned with the bin collection issues, because we can't get delivery bays or spaces located directly on Seven Sisters Road, or we do have to service the site from Woodbury Down. The proposal is for those buildings on the north side to use the podium as part of the deliveries strategy. So there are 2 dedicated delivery bays that sit within the podium area, accessible by vans. So your Amazon delivery or John Lewis delivery would come into the podium and then access take the goods to people's properties from there. We've been through a lengthy exercise with the committee about how that would be managed, because it does bring new challenges that aren't present in the other blocks that we're bringing at the moment. And how that will be combined with how the concierge area works and how that space would be managed. I think the big concern that we went through related ultimately back to service charge, and would that then impart additional costs on residents that would be costly and unaffordable, add just more to the cost of living in an urban local area. And the outcome of that goes back to the same point as on the gardens and the amenity. Because of the quantity of people sharing that facility and paying for it, actually the service charge does stay aligned with the rest of the estate.
Okay, and when it comes to application, we'll look at the security of the letterboxes and the sort of usability of those as well, as with some reference to previous developments. No hands, brilliant. I'm going to take that as finished in that case. So thank you very much to the committee. Thank you to the pre-applicants and to all the officers that have been online. I think we've got any other business, but Gareth, you had one.
Just wanted to say the next planning meeting and the last one of the year is the 7th of December.
Right. But otherwise, thank you very much. We had a good run through the entire thing. So thank you for participating. Cheers.